A Place to Rest by Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Wynne Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1. The Cursed Forest. The last rays of sunlight caught the crystalline sheen of Draven's skin as he trudged along the worn dirt path, each step measured and purposeful. His weathered traveling pack shifted against his broad shoulders, the familiar weight of his mercenary gear a reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. The leather of his boots was scuffed from countless miles, much like the calloused hands that had seen too many battles. Willowmeadow emerged from the deepening twilight like a painting half hidden in shadow. Draven's amber eyes traced the outlines of cottages with their peaked roofs and climbing ivy, but something felt off about the scene. Windows snapped shut as he approached, and villagers who had been lingering in their gardens suddenly found urgent business indoors. The air hung thick with unspoken fears, reminding him of towns that had faced raiders or worse. A child's bright laughter pierced the heavy silence, clear as a bell. "Mama, look! His skin sparkles like the rocks in the creek." "Hush now, come inside," came the swift response, followed by the sharp click of a closing door. Draven's lips tightened into a thin line as his enhanced vision caught the telltale marks above the doorways, protection runes, carved recently and with more haste than skill. Some were still raw in the wood, sawdust collecting on the windowsills below. His fingers traced the stone-like texture of his skin, offering little comfort as he noted how many homes bore these desperate wards. The earth magic in his blood stirred restlessly, responding to the villagers' fear. The village square opened before him, its cobblestones arranged in intricate patterns that spoke of older, deeper magics. A cluster of elders stood near the well, their gray heads bent together in consultation. At his approach, they scattered like autumn leaves in a sudden wind, their robes swishing against the stones as they retreated to separate corners of the square. An old orcish battle hymn rose in his throat, one his unit had sung before particularly dangerous missions, "When stone meets steel and earth drinks deep." He caught himself transforming the martial rhythm into a quiet hum. The sound helped ground him as unwanted memories surfaced. The clash of weapons, the metallic tang of blood, the weight of coin earned through violence. But something else tugged at his awareness, something that had nothing to do with suspicious glances or hastily carved runes. The magical ley lines beneath Willowmeadow pulsed against his stone elemental senses like blood through veins, but their rhythm was wrong. Instead of the steady, harmonious flow he'd felt in other magical settlements, these currents seemed to stutter and jump, like a stream trying to flow around an unseen obstruction. Draven paused, planting his feet more firmly on the cobblestones. He closed his eyes, letting his connection to the earth deepen. The wrongness became more pronounced, ley line energy pooling where it should flow, racing where it should meander, creating knots of magical tension that made his teeth ache. "Best move along, stranger," a voice called out, breaking his concentration. "The inn at Millerton's only half a day's walk from here." Draven opened his eyes to find one of the elders had gathered enough courage to address him. The man's stance was meant to project authority, but Draven noted how his hands trembled slightly as they gripped his walking stick. "I mean to stay," Draven replied, his voice low and steady as stone. He gestured toward an abandoned building at the edge of the square, its windows dark and its sign hanging askew. "That inn. Is it for sale?" The elder's eyes widened, darting between Draven and the dilapidated structure. "That old place?" "It's been empty since—" He caught himself, swallowing whatever history he'd been about to share. "It's not fit for habitation." "I'll be the judge of that." Draven's bracers hummed faintly against his wrists as he studied the building's stone foundation. Despite the obvious neglect, the bones were good, strong. Like him, it just needed a chance at redemption. The disturbed ley lines pulsed beneath his feet again, and this time he thought he understood. Sometimes the best way to protect a place wasn't to fight its battles, but to give it shelter, to create a sanctuary where weary souls could find rest and healing. His days of selling his strength to the highest bidder were over. Here, in this troubled village with its frightened people and wounded magic, he would build something different, something better. The wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp, astringent scent of protective herbs. Draven's nostrils flared as he identified each one. Sage's earthen musk, rowan's bitter tang, and thistle's spiky green note. The bundles hung from nearly every eave and windowsill, some fresh enough that their leaves still held their color, others dried to brittle brown. He'd seen similar arrangements in villages plagued by dark magic or supernatural threats, though rarely in such quantities. His boots scraped against the cobblestones as he made his way to the village well. The water within was mirror still, and Draven found himself gripping the stone rim, studying his reflection in the gathering dusk. New scars marked his moss-green skin, the slash across his jaw from the incident in Ravencross, the burn along his temple from the witch's curse. His amber eyes looked older than he remembered, heavy with the weight of choices that had seemed right at the time, but left marks deeper than any blade. The stone beneath his fingers hummed with residual magic, and he realized the well itself was built atop a minor ley line confluence. No wonder the villagers hadn't abandoned Willowmeadow entirely, despite whatever troubled them. The water here would have protective properties, subtle but real. Movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention to the forest beyond the village boundaries. Ancient oaks and elms stood like sentinels, their branches twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. As he watched, the leaves rustled in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, creating shadow patterns that reminded him of warning runes. His stone, elemental heritage made him particularly sensitive to such signs. The earth itself seemed to be trying to communicate something. Draven straightened, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension gathering there. His gaze swept the village perimeter, noting the recent attempts at fortification. Earthen berms had been hastily constructed, their slopes uneven and prone to erosion. Wooden stakes protruded at awkward angles, more likely to trip the defenders than stop any serious threat. His fingers twisted the stone-forged ring on his hand, its familiar weight offering little comfort as he noted how many homes bore these desperate wards. The simple band, earned during his first attempts to control his powers, helped focus his abilities, though lately it felt inadequate for the strength stirring in his blood. "That's far enough, stranger." The voice came from behind him, steady but tense. Draven turned slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his sides. A village guard stood several paces away, hand resting on the pommel of a sword that had seen better days. The guard's armor was mismatched, a leather jerkin over chainmail that didn't quite fit, suggesting it had been scrounged rather than properly issued. "Peace, friend." Draven kept his voice low and even, though experience had taught him that his size and orcish features often spoke louder than words. He shifted his weight slightly, adopting what he hoped was a less imposing stance. "I'm simply seeking lodging for the night." The guard's eyes flicked to Draven's bracers, then to his face. "We've had enough trouble lately without—" He caught himself, jaw tightening. "The inn's closed, has been for months." So I've heard? Draven gestured toward the abandoned building. I'm interested in purchasing it, actually. Who would I speak with about that? The question seemed to throw the guard off balance. He blinked, hand loosening slightly on his sword. The council holds the deed, but... He frowned, studying Draven more carefully now. You're serious about buying that place? I am! The setting sun painted long shadows across the cobblestones between them, and Draven noted how the guard positioned himself to keep the light at his back. Not entirely untrained, then. I have experience with such establishments. Experience? The guard's tone suggested he was having trouble reconciling Draven's warrior-like appearance with the idea of innkeeping. Everyone has a past, Draven said simply, and everyone deserves a chance to build something new. The guard was silent for a long moment, consideration warring with caution in his expression. Finally, he nodded toward a building near the square, its windows still lit despite the deepening dusk. Council meets there. Elder Moira's probably still about. She handles property matters. He paused, then added with careful neutrality, If you're truly interested in staying, you should know this village has difficulties. I've noticed. Draven glanced meaningfully at the protective herbs and amateur fortifications. Perhaps what Willowmeadow needs is someone willing to face those difficulties head-on, rather than another traveler passing through. The guard's posture shifted subtly, some of the wariness bleeding away. Maybe so. He stepped aside, clearing Draven's path to the council building. But watch yourself. Some troubles can't be solved with strength alone. No, Draven agreed quietly, thinking of his own journey here. They rarely can. The worn tavern table creaked beneath Draven's forearms as he carefully unfolded the map, its weathered surface catching the uneven light of nearby candles. The parchment carried the musty scent of age, but beneath that lingered something else, a hint of ozone and stone dust that stirred memories of deep caves and ancient chambers. Runes sprawled across the surface in elaborate patterns, their lines seeming to writhe whenever he tried to focus directly on them. Draven had seen plenty of enchanted maps in his mercenary days, but this one felt different. The magic woven into it resonated with something in his blood, like a half-remembered song. Here you are, dear. A weathered halfling woman appeared at his elbow, setting down a mug that steamed with something that smelled of cloves and honey. Her silver hair was bound in a neat braid, though wisps had escaped to frame her face. She moved to turn away, but her eyes caught on the map and she froze mid-step. The color drained from her face. That leads to the old hearth and crust, she whispered, her voice quavering. Her fingers twisted in her apron, knuckles white with tension. Draven kept his expression neutral, though he noted how her gaze darted between the map and the tavern's grimy windows. You're familiar with it? She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped as movement outside drew their attention. Shadows stretched across the floor as several villagers gathered near the windows, their silhouettes dark against the dying daylight. Their murmured conversations drifted through the thin glass. Just like before, when the lights started. Cursed place, should have torn it down years ago. Warning the stranger, surely someone's told him about the inn. The halfling woman took a half-step back, but before she could retreat, an elderly man approached their table with the quiet authority of one used to being heard. His robes, though simple, bore the subtle embroidery that marked him as a village elder. Without invitation, he lowered himself into the chair across from Draven. Those aren't ordinary mapping runes, the elder said, his voice rough with age but steady. He reached out, pointing to a cluster of symbols near what appeared to be the inn's foundation. As his gnarled finger approached, the runes pulsed with a soft green light. See here? These speak of guardian stones, ancient wards carved into the very bones of the earth. The elder's eyes flicked meaningfully to Draven's bracers, their stone-like texture catching the candlelight. The crowd at the windows had grown, their whispers taking on an urgent tone. Something stirred in Draven's blood, a resonance that made his skin prickle. The stone, elemental heritage that usually slumbered quietly in his veins awakened, responding to whatever magic was woven into the map's fabric. He felt the familiar warmth behind his eyes that meant they were glowing, their amber light intensifying. Concerned murmurs rippled through the watching villagers. Someone made a warding gesture. "Blessed earth!" the halfling woman breathed, taking another step back. But Draven barely noticed their reactions. The map beneath his fingers had grown warm, almost hot to the touch. New lines were appearing, bleeding through the parchment like ink rising to the surface. They formed a delicate webwork that perfectly matched the ley line patterns he'd sensed earlier while standing by the well. The elder leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. "Fascinating. The map responds to your blood," Stone touched one. "Those patterns—" He traced the air above the newly revealed lines, careful not to touch the parchment directly. "They show the flow of power beneath our village. Power that's been acting strange of late." "Strange how?" Draven asked, studying how the ley line markings seemed to converge beneath the inn's location. The coincidence, if it was one, seemed unlikely. The elder opened his mouth to respond, but the halfling woman cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Moira, don't. Some things are better left unspoken, especially with night falling." Outside, the sun had indeed slipped below the horizon, leaving the village in the grip of deep twilight. The candlelight seemed to retreat, creating deeper shadows in the tavern's corners. The map's green glow cast an ethereal light across their faces, making the elder's weathered features look carved from stone. "Knowledge is protection, Rosie," the elder Moira replied firmly. He turned back to Draven. "The wards are failing. We've managed to patch the worst spots with hedge magic and good intentions, but—" He shook his head. "This village needs a proper guardian, someone who can speak to the stones themselves. The old protections were meant to be maintained by one with earth in their blood." The runes pulsed again, stronger this time, and Draven felt an answering surge in his bracers. The stone-shaping magic that usually came to him in careful measures now rose eager and strong, as if recognizing something in the map's ancient enchantments. His fingertips tingled where they touched the parchment, and for a moment he could almost see the lattice of power lines beneath the village streets, glowing like veins of precious ore in the earth's dark heart. A young woman pushed through the crowd, her movements urgent despite the sleeping child bundled against her chest. Draven noted how the other villagers made way for her, their expressions a mix of sympathy and unease. As she reached their table, she shifted her child to one arm, extending her right palm under the candlelight. "My grandfather was the last to try clearing that place," she said, her voice tight with remembered pain. The scar tissue on her palm formed an intricate pattern that made Draven's eyes narrow. It perfectly matched one of the protection runes on the map. "This was his final warning to us. The marks appeared on my hand the day he—" She trailed off, pulling her child closer. The map's heat against his fingers increased, and Draven found himself unconsciously humming an old Orcish battle hymn, one his mother had taught him for focusing troubled thoughts. The low, resonant notes seemed to sink into the floorboards, causing the drinks on nearby tables to shiver in their cups. The halfling tavern keeper retreated behind her bar, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Draven turned his attention back to the map, tracing the detailed rendering of the Hearth and Crust Inn in the corner. Something about the architecture bothered him. The angles didn't quite align, as if the artist had attempted to draw the building from multiple perspectives at once. Windows appeared where they couldn't possibly exist, and staircases curved in ways that defied natural geometry. His stone sense tingled, suggesting the building somehow occupied several spaces simultaneously, like a crystal with faces that caught light from impossible directions. The growing tension in the room broke as thunder rolled overhead, despite the clear evening sky he'd noticed earlier. Draven carefully folded the map, each precise movement watched by the silent crowd. The parchment felt alive beneath his fingers, almost eager to be handled. His bracers thrummed in response, the stone-like texture of their surface rippling faintly. As he stood, chair scraping against worn floorboards. An elderly man in faded mage robes stepped between him and the door. Unlike the other villagers who'd given him a wide berth, this one planted himself firmly in Draven's path. Silver runes embroidered his sleeves, marking him as a practitioner of formal magic rather than the hedge wizardry common in small villages. "The inn chooses its guardian, Orc," the mage said, his voice carrying the weight of formal warning. "Are you certain it's chosen you?" Draven met the mage's gaze steadily, letting his amber eyes glow just bright enough to cast shadows on the man's weathered face. He didn't respond. There was no need. The map's warmth against his chest, safely tucked in his inner pocket, spoke volumes, as did the steady hum of his bracers, their power responding to something ancient and familiar in the air around them. The mage studied him for a long moment before stepping aside with a slight nod, as if satisfied by whatever he'd seen in Draven's expression. The evening air carried the crisp edge of approaching autumn as Draven stepped outside. Villagers scattered before him like leaves in a breeze, creating a clear path down the cobblestone street. The map pulsed against his chest in time with his heartbeat, while his bracers hummed with barely contained energy. Their usual steady warmth had transformed into something more urgent, more purposeful, as if they recognized the challenge that lay ahead. The stone beneath his feet whispered ancient secrets through the soles of his boots. Now that he knew to look for them, he could sense the ley lines crossing beneath the village and the worrying gaps in their once steady flow. Like a dam with hairline cracks, the village's protective wards were failing one tiny fissure at a time. Draven paused, letting his stone sense reach deeper. There, beneath the surface weakness, he felt something else, a foundation of power, old and deep, waiting to be properly tapped. Not unlike the power that ran through his own veins, dormant until he'd learned to embrace his heritage rather than fight it. The thunder rolled again, closer now, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. A wind picked up, carrying the scent of stone dust and ozone, the same scent he'd noticed on the map. Ahead, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a path led toward the forest's edge where the inn waited. The last rays of sunlight caught his bracers, making the stone-like surface gleam. Their power thrummed through his arms, eager to shape and protect, to mend what was broken. It felt right in a way few things had since he'd left his mercenary life behind. Not an escape this time, but a purpose. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. Draven knelt at the village's edge, where worn cobblestones gave way to packed earth and scattered pine needles. The last traces of sunset painted long shadows across the ground as he pressed his palm flat against the soil. His ring pulsed with gentle verdant light, the stone-like surface warming against his skin as he reached out with his other senses, the ones that spoke of earth and ancient things. The ley lines thrummed beneath the surface, their steady rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Like the tides or a sleeping giant's breath, magic flowed through the invisible channels beneath Willowmeadow, until dash. A discordant surge rippled through the pattern, sharp and jagged. Draven flinched, memories flooding back unbidden. The same sickening pulse he'd felt on battlefields where hedge mages threw raw power at each other until the earth itself screamed. His fingers curled into the dirt, fighting the urge to throw up defensive barriers. "Not here," he murmured, forcing his breathing to steady. "Not now." Standing slowly, he pulled off his boots, letting them drop beside him with soft thuds. The direct contact between his feet and the soil sent a shiver up his spine. His stone-touched skin recognized its kin, awakening old memories he'd rather forget. The skirmish where he'd first discovered his heritage hadn't been particularly bloody as mercenary work went, but the way the ground had responded to his desperate cry for help. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the present. His eyes glowed amber in the deepening twilight as he sought the source of the disruption. Like a dowsing rod seeking water, his body swayed slightly, drawn toward there. the same direction the map had indicated, where the inn's crooked towers should rise above the tree line. Another surge pulsed through the ley lines, stronger this time. Small pebbles skittered around his feet, drawn to his presence like iron filings to a lodestone. Before he could stop himself, his hands moved in familiar patterns. Earth responded, a knee-high wall rising in a smooth arc before him. Battle-hewn instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed at him to reinforce it, to prepare for— "No!" he growled, forcing the wall to crumble back into loose soil. He wasn't that person anymore, hadn't been for years. His stone-forged ring warmed against his skin, a familiar sensation that usually preceded discoveries related to his elemental heritage. The old orcish battle hymn rose naturally to his lips, more meditation than war cry. Low notes resonated with the stone beneath his feet, creating harmonies that rippled outward like rings in still water. As he hummed, new patterns emerged in the magical disturbance. Not the chaotic destruction of battle magic, but something more purposeful, like a lock waiting for its key, or a door that had been closed so long it had forgotten how to open. The sensation tugged at something deep in his chest, where the map rested in his inner pocket. Its warmth seemed to pulse in time with his humming, adding subtle counter-melodies to the stone song beneath his feet. His stone-forged ring joined the chorus, its soft green glow steadying as the three rhythms, earth, map, and stone-touched orc, aligned into something that felt almost like belonging. Though the ring strained to channel the converging energies, the harmony felt right, as if he'd found a piece of a larger pattern he'd been seeking without knowing it. Thunder rolled again overhead, but this time Draven recognized it for what it was, the sound of ancient wards shifting in their sleep, responding to his presence, to his purpose. The path before him seemed to sharpen in focus, winding between old growth pines toward whatever waited at its end. Whatever had been waiting for him perhaps since before he knew to look for it. He retrieved his boots but didn't put them back on, choosing instead to walk barefoot. Each step connected him more firmly to the ley network beneath, helping him map its damaged flows. The disruptions formed a pattern now, like a series of cracks spiraling outward from a central point, or perhaps spiraling inward, drawing power toward something hungry and patient and old. His humming never faltered, though the harmonies grew more complex. Stone sense and battle instincts merged into something new as he walked, each complementing rather than fighting the other. The earth remembered him, welcomed him, even as it warned him of the task ahead. Draven knelt in a small clearing, pressing both palms flat against the cool earth. The ring hummed against his skin as he channeled his power downward, sending careful pulses of energy through the soil. Like a dam trying to control a flood, the simple band struggled to focus his growing abilities. Like ripples in a pond, the magic spread outward, mapping the invisible currents beneath the surface. The feedback made him wince. Concentrated pockets of magic dotted the landscape like bruises, places where the natural flow had been twisted or blocked. Some were small, barely noticeable disturbances that might heal on their own. Others felt raw and angry, festering wounds in the earth's energy that made his stone-touched blood run cold. "Show me," he whispered, more to himself than the ring. Its glow intensified, the crystalline core brightening dangerously as he pushed more power into the connection than the simple band was meant to handle. The map in his chest pocket warmed in response, as if eager to help. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he maintained the delicate balance. The warrior in him wanted to treat this like battlefield reconnaissance. Identify threats, establish defensive positions, prepare for combat. But that approach would only make things worse. The earth responded to intention as much as action, and he needed to heal, not harm. The quiet song of stone beneath his fingers changed pitch suddenly, making him grit his teeth. Nearby rocks cracked with sharp reports, fragments skittering across the ground toward him like eager puppies. His hands clenched involuntarily, muscle memory trying to shape the stone into familiar forms: spikes, shields, projectiles, tools of war. "Not anymore," he growled, forcing his fingers to relax. The broken rocks settled, though they continued to pulse with unsettling energy. Through his connection to the earth, echoes of old violence rippled up through his palms. The sensation was horribly familiar, the same residual energy he'd felt in countless battlefields where magic and malice had scarred the land itself. But this was older, deeper. Whatever had happened here had left wounds that 50 years hadn't managed to heal. His jaw tightened as fragments of memory tried to surface, the crack of stone beneath his feet as he'd lost control of his power for the first time. The way the earth had responded to his rage, his fear, his desperate need to survive. The aftermath, when he'd seen what his untrained abilities could do. Draven shook his head sharply, dispelling the memories. With deliberate care, he lifted one hand and traced a protective rune in the dirt beside him. The simple pattern glowed briefly green before fading, its magic settling into the ground like a gentle rain. It wasn't much, a basic ward against further corruption, but it felt right. This was why he'd walked away from mercenary work, why he'd spent years learning to use his power differently. Protection, not destruction. Healing, not harm. Rising slowly, he brushed dirt from his knees, grimacing at the way his muscles protested. He wasn't young anymore, and maintaining such precise control over his abilities took more out of him than the broad destruction of his military days. The ring dimmed as he broke contact with the ground, but the memory of what he'd sensed lingered like an ache in his bones. The magical disturbance was worse than he'd initially feared. Whatever had happened here hadn't just damaged the inn. It had wounded the very foundations of the land. The ley lines were tangled and kinked, like a river trying to flow through broken banks. In some places, the magic felt almost solid, crystallized into dangerous concentrations that could shatter at any moment. And at the center of it all, where the map indicated the inn should be, something waited. Something that resonated with his stone sense so powerfully that his ring hummed in response, its simple enchantments barely containing the connection. Whether that was good or bad remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when the earth itself seemed to be calling him to this place. The sun had fully set while he worked, leaving only starlight to illuminate the path ahead. His eyes adjusted easily, the faint amber glow providing just enough light to navigate by. The weight of the map in his pocket seemed heavier now, as if it too sensed they were getting close to whatever destiny it had been leading him toward. Draven stood at the forest's edge, methodically checking his supplies in the deepening twilight. His reflection caught his eye in the polished surface of his bracer, amber eyes glowing faintly, set in a face that had seen too much. The weight of self-imposed exile pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavier here at the threshold of whatever waited ahead. The leather of his pack creaked as he withdrew a worn pouch, its surface smooth from years of handling. His calloused fingers traced the embossed insignia of the Stone Fist Company, a gauntlet clutching a mountain peak. The symbol that had defined his life for so long now felt foreign, like touching a stranger's belongings. With practiced movements that spoke of finality, he untied the pouch from his belt and set it aside. The small sound it made hitting the ground seemed to echo in the growing darkness. A whisper rippled through the trees. Not wind, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. The sound triggered memories he'd rather forget. Stone cracking like thunder as his power erupted unchecked. Screams of surprise turning to horror. The sickening moment of revelation when he'd seen what his abilities could do to friend and foe alike. His fingers curled into the dirt, fighting the urge to throw up defensive barriers. The ring pulsed once with gentle, verdant light, responding to his distress, and he forced his breathing to slow. Mist curled around his boots as he crouched to sort through the herbs in his pack. Each bundle had been carefully selected and wrapped in cloth. Sage for cleansing, rowan for protection, yarrow for healing. The sharp, clean scent of sage brought back memories of gentler times, of Vara, the old healer who'd first recognized what he was. "Stone speaks in your blood," she'd told him, pressing dried herbs into his trembling hands. "But you get to choose what it says." A wolf's howl pierced the darkness, closer than he'd expected. His body responded before his mind could catch up, dropping into a defensive stance as his power thrummed through his veins. The earth responded instantly to his presence, pebbles and soil trembling with barely contained energy, while his ring's warmth reminded him to maintain control. Draven caught himself, deliberately relaxing his posture and letting the power subside. The old battle hymn rose unbidden to his lips, a quiet hum that seemed to carry all the weight of his regrets in its ancient melody. The night air had grown cool enough to bite. Draven shrugged off his heavy traveling cloak, the motion pulling at old scars that mapped his skin like pale rivers through green stone. The largest tracked across his left shoulder, a reminder of the blade that had nearly ended him in Thornhaven. Smaller marks decorated his forearms, some from weapons, others from his own stone shards turning against him before he'd learned control. The worst was the starburst pattern across his chest, where magical backlash had nearly stopped his heart the day his heritage had awakened. Each scar was a chapter in a story of violence he was desperate to leave behind. Yet here he stood, drawn to this place by forces he didn't fully understand, armed with power he still wasn't sure he could trust. The ring glowed softly in the starlight, its simple enchantments a humble reminder of how far he'd come from his mercenary days, and how far he still had to go in reshaping his power into something better. He repacked his herbs with careful precision, each bundle returning to its proper place. The abandoned company pouch caught his eye, already gathering dew in the grass. Let it fade there, he thought, like the life it represented. The mist continued its slow advance from the trees, carrying scents of moss and decay, of secrets buried in soil and stone. Somewhere ahead lay the inn marked on his map, and with it, perhaps, a chance to use his abilities for something other than destruction. The old battle hymn died in his throat, replaced by the whispers of the forest and the steady pulse of earth magic beneath his feet. Whatever waited in the shadows ahead, he would face it not as a warrior, but as something new, something yet to be defined. The thought should have been frightening, but instead it felt like setting down a burden he'd carried for far too long. The map pulsed in Draven's pocket like a second heartbeat, warm against his hip through the worn leather of his belt pouch. He withdrew it carefully, weathered fingers tracing the intricate lines that led deeper into the shadowed forest. The elder's words echoed in his mind. A guardian's strength flows from the earth itself, protecting what matters most. His lips twisted in a bitter smile. If only the old woman knew how much destruction that same earth strength could wreak when wielded as a weapon. Kneeling at the forest's edge, Draven pressed his palm to the damp soil. A small boulder emerged at his touch, rising from the ground with a gentle rumble. The stone-forged ring glowed softly as he worked, guiding his touch. Where once he might have carved notches to count lives taken, his fingers now shaped different marks into the rock's surface, protective runes that would guide weary travelers toward safety. The magic felt different now, no longer a weapon to be wielded, but a gift to be shared. The stone settled into place with a satisfying weight, its purpose transformed like his own. A puddle caught his eye, mirror still in the evening light. The face that stared back at him was both familiar and strange. Sharp amber eyes that had once watched battlefields now surveyed peaceful woods, the set of his jaw still stern but softened somehow. Moss-green skin bore the faint, crystalline sheen of his elemental heritage, more pronounced now that he'd stopped fighting against it. He barely recognized himself without the war paint and battle scars that had once been his pride. The ground trembled beneath his boots, responding to the turmoil of his thoughts. Small pebbles skittered across the path as the vibrations grew stronger, a reminder of how easily his power could slip its leash. Draven closed his eyes, focusing on the cool stone of his ring against his skin. Its energy pulsed in counterpoint to his racing heart, helping him find that elusive point of balance. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his power back into the earth, smoothing the tremors like ripples in a pond. Each controlled breath marked another small victory over the destructive force that had once defined him. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he arranged his supplies, muscle memory from countless pre-battle inspections guiding each motion. But where he had once checked the edge of blades and the weight of warhammers, he now cataloged healing herbs and protective charms. The precision remained. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to break, but its purpose had shifted. Every item in his pack spoke of shelter rather than harm: dried sage for cleansing, iron nails for warding, smooth river stones for grounding rituals. Drawing himself to his full height, Draven faced the forest path. The mist that had gathered around his feet parted as he took his first step forward, responding to some ancient recognition between stone and earth magic. The soft, verdant light from his ring merged with his natural stone-touched glow, pushing back the shadows not to expose enemies, but to light the way for others who might follow. His shoulders, once squared for combat, now bore a different kind of strength, the steady resolve of a protector rather than the tension of a warrior. The old battle stance tried to assert itself with each step, ingrained responses urging him to scan for ambush points and tactical advantages. Instead, he forced himself to notice different things: the way certain trees naturally formed sheltering archways, spots where the ground felt solid enough to support foundations, places where the land's natural energy ran strong and true. His stone sense, once used to detect weaknesses in enemy fortifications, now sought the perfect place to build something lasting. The map's warmth intensified as he ventured deeper into the woods, as if responding to his shifted intentions. Each pulse seemed to whisper of possibility, of redemption, of a future where his power could heal instead of harm. The weight of his past still pressed against his shoulders, but with every step forward, it felt a little lighter, a little more distant, like armor being shed piece by piece. Chapter 3. The Journey Begins. The forest swallowed Draven's footsteps with an eager silence, broken only by the crisp crunch of frost-covered leaves beneath his boots. His amber eyes cut through the unnatural darkness, catching glimpses of movement at the edge of his vision that vanished when he turned to look. The temperature plummeted with each step, until his breath clouded before him in pale wisps. Something about this cold felt wrong, not the natural chill of approaching winter, but a deeper cold that seemed to reach for his bones. His stone sense tingled uncomfortably, like the ground itself was recoiling from whatever tainted this place. A deliberate rustle drew his attention to the left, too precise, too calculated to be the wind. His stone-touched blood stirred as he reached out with his other senses, feeling the minute vibrations through the earth. Something was moving out there, its presence leaving ripples through the ground like pebbles dropped in still water. Draven remained motionless, watching as shadow tendrils began to slither between the trees. They moved with purpose, weaving together like dark threads until they formed a vaguely humanoid shape that towered over him. His muscles tensed instinctively, battle reflexes screaming at him to strike first. But he forced himself still, remembering the elder's words about observation before action. Whatever this creature was, it hadn't attacked yet, and he was done letting combat be his first response to the unknown. The shadow being circled him with fluid grace, leaving behind a trail of withered vegetation. Leaves crumbled to dust where it passed, frost patterns spreading across the ground in its wake. Draven began to hum softly, an old orcish battle hymn rising unbidden to his lips. The familiar melody helped him focus, keeping his breathing steady as he subtly shifted his stance. Through his connection to the earth, he began reshaping the ground beneath his feet, creating subtle variations in elevation that would give him better defensive positioning. Without warning, the creature lunged. Draven's hand shot up, power flowing through him as he called to the earth. A stone barrier erupted between them, rough-hewn and solid, but the shadow being split around it like smoke, reforming on the other side. Where its essence touched the stone, intricate patterns of frost bloomed across the surface, causing the rock to crack and splinter. The sight of his barrier crumbling sent a surge of power through Draven's veins. He channeled it downward, sending a pulse through the ground that rippled outward from his position. Small stone pillars burst from the earth in a perfect circle around him, each one carved with the protective runes he'd practiced so many times since leaving his warrior past behind. His stone-touched skin hummed with the effort of controlling such precise work, so different from the destructive force he'd once wielded. The shadow creature recoiled with a hiss that sounded like winter wind through dead branches. It drew back from the pillars as if they burned, its form becoming less distinct. The runes he'd carved began to glow with a faint, warm light, not the harsh glare of combat magic, but something steadier, more grounding. Draven's humming never faltered, though he shifted the melody to something older, something that spoke more of protection than victory. His stone sense told him the creature was still there, testing the boundary of his circle, searching for weaknesses, but its movements seemed less predatory now, more cautious, almost curious. The frost patterns it left behind were changing too. Where before they had spread like decay, now they formed intricate spirals and whirls that reminded him of the decorative carvings he'd practiced during sleepless nights at warrior camps. His barrier had crumbled, yes, but something about the way the frost had transformed its surface nagged at his thoughts. This wasn't simple destruction, it was transformation. His ring thrummed steadily, responding to both his power and his insight. The stone pillars stood firm, but their edges softened slightly, the runes' glow warming from defensive brightness to something more welcoming. He didn't lower his guard, but he allowed his stance to relax fractionally, showing the creature he was ready to defend himself but not eager to attack. The shadow being paused its circling, gathering itself into a more defined shape. The temperature around them stabilized, no longer dropping but maintaining a crisp chill that cleared Draven's thoughts. His battle hymn faded to a gentle undertone as he waited, wondering if perhaps this encounter didn't have to end in conflict after all. A tendril of darkness whipped toward Draven's face, his body responding before his mind could catch up. He twisted aside, the movement as natural as breathing despite his broad frame. His old combat training took over, carrying him through a series of fluid dodges as more shadows lashed out. The earth whispered warnings through his bare feet, attack from the left, movement behind. His stone-touched hands found the oak's trunk, power flowing from his blood into the bark. Rough handholds emerged in a spiraling path upward. Without hesitation, he grabbed the first one, using his momentum to vault over another tendril that struck where he'd stood moments before. But when he landed and turned to face the creature, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow being had shifted, its amorphous form solidifying into a mirror image of himself. Yet the reflection it showed wasn't the innkeeper he'd become. It was the mercenary he'd been. Blood-spattered armor, eyes hard with battle rage, hands stained with choices he'd spent years trying to wash away. Draven faltered, his humming cutting off mid-note. The shadow self grinned with savage satisfaction, an expression he recognized from countless battlefields. His stone-touched blood stirred beneath his skin, responding to his spike of emotion. But the power that surged through him felt different now, less like a weapon, more like an anchor. He planted his feet firmly, reconnecting with the steady presence of stone beneath him, Power flowed through his legs and into the ground, sending tremors rippling outward, but instead of rupturing the earth as he once would have, he shaped it with deliberate precision. Concentric circles rose from the frost-covered soil, each one inscribed with the protective runes he'd spent countless nights practicing. They began to glow with a gentle warmth, like sunlight through honey. The shadow creature's form wavered, drawing back from the circles of light. Its edges became less distinct, the mirror image of his past self fragmenting like smoke in a strong wind. Draven observed its reaction carefully, noting how it seemed to lose cohesion wherever the warm light touched it. Not destruction, dispersal. The knowledge settled into his mind like a stone finding its perfect place in a wall. Moving with measured grace, he channeled more power through his ring. The ground responded eagerly, crystalline spires rising in a complex geometric pattern around the shadow being. Each spire caught and reflected the light from his runes, multiplying their gentle radiance. He shaped them with the same care he used when carving protective charms into the inn's furniture, focusing on containment rather than harm. The shadow creature writhed within the crystal cage, its form breaking apart into wisps of darkness. Where it touched the spires, frost bloomed across their surfaces in intricate patterns. Draven's eyes narrowed as he recognized the shapes. They matched the cryptic runes on his map, but with subtle variations that suggested meaning just beyond his grasp. As the last traces of shadow dispersed, Draven remained still, amber eyes glowing softly in the lingering light of his runes. His expression stayed neutral, but satisfaction warmed his chest like a sip of well-brewed tea. He'd faced darkness without becoming it, protected without destroying. The crystal spires caught the weak forest light, transforming it into something almost beautiful. His fingers traced the patterns of frost, memorizing their shapes. The cold no longer felt hostile. Instead, it carried the crisp clarity of a winter morning when the world held its breath before sunrise. His ring cooled against his skin, settling into a comfortable warmth that matched his steady heartbeat. The battle hymn that had guided his movements shifted in his mind, the melody transforming into something gentler. Not a song of victory, but one of balance found, of choices made differently. His stone sense told him the shadow being was truly gone, leaving behind only these frozen runes and the quiet certainty that he'd passed some kind of test. Draven examined the crystalline formation he'd created, noting how the spires caught and reflected light in ways that might be useful for the inn's defenses. Each challenge was a lesson, if viewed with the right perspective. He'd learned more from this encounter than any victory on the battlefield had taught him. The forest around him slowly returned to life, birds cautiously resuming their songs, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. His changes to the landscape remained, the concentric circles with their softly glowing runes, the crystal spires with their delicate frost patterns. Not scars on the earth, but additions that felt right, as if they'd always been meant to exist here. He straightened his leather apron, brushing off fragments of frost that had settled there. The warrior's instincts that had saved him would always be part of him, but they were tools now, not chains. Like the stone he shaped, he too could be transformed without being destroyed. A faint green glow caught Draven's attention, drawing his gaze downward. Bioluminescent moss spread across the forest floor in an intricate spiral pattern, each tendril unfurling with deliberate purpose. His stone sense thrummed with awareness. Something ancient and powerful moved through the trees, its presence as fluid as water but as deeply rooted as the mountains themselves. The moss continued its mesmerizing dance at his feet, and Draven remained still, letting his connection to the earth tell him what his eyes couldn't. Beneath the surface, ley lines stirred and shifted, responding to the approaching entity with a gentle resonance that felt almost like welcome. A figure emerged from behind an ancient oak, moving with such natural grace that she seemed to flow rather than walk. Draven's breath caught as he recognized Silvara Greenglow, the dryad's ivy-like hair floating as if stirred by a breeze he couldn't feel. Tiny blossoms woven through her verdant locks pulsed with soft light, and he realized with surprise that they matched the rhythm of the battle hymn he'd been humming. His voice faltered, but the flowers continued their gentle luminescence. Silvara circled him with unhurried steps, each footfall birthing new patterns of glowing moss. Her presence carried the weight of centuries, yet felt as light as morning dew. She paused at the frost patterns left by the shadow creature, tilting her head in a way that reminded Draven of birds studying particularly interesting seeds. Her deep green eyes held mysteries older than the forest itself, and he found himself wondering what stories those eyes had witnessed. "The stones sing of your approach, guardian," she said, her voice carrying notes that reminded him of wind through crystal chimes. She reached out to touch one of his crystalline spires, and the stone rang with a clear, pure tone that resonated with his stone-forged ring. The sound felt right somehow, as if the crystal had been waiting for precisely that note. The ring's gentle glow intensified as Silvara drew closer, its simple enchantments harmonizing with her natural magic in unexpected ways. A knowing smile played across her features, the texture of her bark-like skin catching the bioluminescent light in fascinating patterns. She reached for a worn leather pouch at her hip, movements precise and deliberate. "Your path bears the weight of transformation," Silvara observed, selecting herbs with careful fingers. The plants seemed to respond to her touch, their colors shifting like sunlight through leaves, like a seed breaking free from stone to seek the light. Draven watched, fascinated, as the herbs changed hue beneath her practiced hands. A sprig of something that had been deep purple moments ago now shimmered with gold undertones. "I seek only to protect what needs protecting," he responded, his voice rougher than usual against the forest's quiet. "Ah, but protection takes many forms," Silvara said, arranging the color-changing herbs in a pattern that echoed the moss spirals at their feet. "As you've shown today." She gestured to his crystal formation, where the frost patterns still held their mysterious shapes. His elemental nature hummed beneath his stone-like skin, responding to some unspoken communication between Silvara's herbs and his stone constructs. The sensation wasn't uncomfortable, but it stirred something deep in his awareness, a recognition of magic far older than his own. The dryad's movements were hypnotic as she worked, her fingers weaving patterns in the air that left trailing echoes of green light. Each gesture seemed to carry purpose, though its meaning eluded him. The herbs in her hands continued their subtle transformations, and Draven noticed that the frost patterns on his crystal spires had begun to shift in response, like ripples spreading across still water. "The forest remembers those who listen," Silvara continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that complemented his paused battle hymn. "And the stones, they remember longest of all." She fixed him with those ancient green eyes, and Draven felt seen in a way that went beyond simple observation. It was as if she were reading the story written in his very essence, like studying the layers in a cliff face. The moss at their feet pulsed once, brightly, and Draven's stone sense registered a subtle shift in the ley lines beneath them. Something was changing, but unlike the violent transformations of his past, this felt natural, like watching spring slowly wake the world from winter's dream. Draven watched in fascination as Silvara wove the transformed herbs into an intricate pattern. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, each plant finding its place as naturally as stones settling in a riverbed. What caught his attention, though, was how the arrangement mirrored the runes on his map. Runes she couldn't possibly have seen, as it remained tucked securely in his vest. "The foundations remember," she murmured, threading a sprig of silver-veined thyme through what he recognized as the rune for sanctuary. Stone and soil whisper tales of Hearthfire and haven, of doors that opened to those most in need. Her hands never faltered as she worked, weaving in strands of the gold-touched purple herb. The inn's heart beats still, though its pulse has grown quiet. The charm took shape beneath her skilled fingers, each herb corresponding to another rune. Protection, welcome, strength, shelter. Draven's stone sense tingled as the pattern completed itself, resonating with the ley lines beneath their feet. Silvara held the finished charm aloft, and soft green light pulsed from its center. The shadows that had been creeping back toward them recoiled, retreating into the deeper forest. But what truly caught Draven's attention was how the charm affected his connection to the earth beneath them. His awareness of the stone deepened, not in the sharp, weapon-ready way he'd known as a mercenary, but in a manner that reminded him of roots seeking soil. He flexed his fingers, testing this new sensation. The crystal spires he'd created earlier responded differently now. Instead of rising as barriers, they seemed to hum with protective energy, like shields rather than spears. His stone-touched blood stirred with approval at this gentler expression of power. "Come," Silvara said, her voice carrying that crystal chime quality that seemed to resonate with his elemental nature. She led him to an ancient oak, its trunk wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. As they drew closer, Draven's breath caught. There, carved into the bark in weathered lines, were patterns identical to those etched in stone across his homeland. Patterns he hadn't seen since discovering his heritage. "The inn has waited 50 years for one who understands the balance between strength and shelter," she explained, tracing the patterns with reverent fingers. "Many have passed this way seeking power or refuge, but few grasp that true protection requires both." When Draven reached for the charm she'd crafted, their fingers brushed. The world shifted, blurred, then reformed into a vision that stole his breath. The Hearth and Crust Inn stood before them, but not as the abandoned shell he'd glimpsed earlier. This inn pulsed with life and warmth, its windows glowing with welcoming light. He could feel its purpose humming through the stones of its foundation. A sanctuary, yes, but also a fortress of comfort against the darkness. Magical beings of all kinds passed through its doors, finding rest and safety within its walls. The vision faded, but the feeling of rightness it sparked lingered in his chest. Silvara's eyes held the same knowing look they'd worn since she'd emerged from the forest. "Your past shaped you like water shapes stone," she said, her voice carrying the whisper of rustling leaves. "But it is your choice to become a shield rather than a sword that drew the inn's attention." From her pouch, she withdrew one final herb, a rare bloom that seemed to capture moonlight in its petals. It pulsed with a soft, silvery radiance as she pressed it into his palm. The flower's light seemed to respond to his touch, brightening slightly. "When you reach the crossroads ahead, let it guide you. The inn knows its own." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, though Draven sensed she spoke from knowledge rather than foresight. Before he could respond, she stepped backward, her form beginning to blur into the forest's shadows. The trailing ivy of her hair merged with the branches above, her bark-like skin blending perfectly with the ancient oak's trunk. In moments, only the spiraling patterns of bioluminescent moss marked where she had stood. Draven looked down at the moonlight bloom in his palm, then at the charm she'd woven. Both thrummed with quiet power, awakening something deep in his elemental nature. The forest around him felt different now, less hostile, more expectant, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. The battle hymn he'd been humming earlier rose unbidden to his thoughts, but now its rhythms spoke less of combat and more of guardianship, of standing firm not to destroy, but to protect. His stone sense reached deeper into the earth, feeling the steady pulse of the ley lines beneath, and for the first time since discovering his elemental heritage, Draven felt truly anchored. The moonlit herb in Draven's palm pulsed gently, its silvery glow intensifying as he made his way through the deepening shadows of the forest. Something about its light seemed to resonate with his stone sense, drawing him forward until he spotted a weathered marker jutting from the earth at an odd angle. His elemental blood stirred beneath his skin, a familiar sensation that usually preceded discoveries related to his heritage. Pushing aside a tangle of brambles, Draven knelt beside the ancient stone. Years of forest growth had claimed it. Thick moss carpeted its surface, while stubborn lichen had worked its way into every groove and crevice. But beneath that verdant shroud, his fingers detected familiar patterns. With careful movements that belied his broad frame, Draven began clearing away the growth. Each sweep of his hand revealed more of the marker's true nature. The runes carved into its face bore the same peculiar sheen as his skin, a subtle gleam that caught what little light filtered through the canopy above. He glanced at his map, comparing the symbols. They matched perfectly, though the ones on the stone held a depth and power that mere ink couldn't capture. Following an impulse he didn't quite understand, Draven traced the largest rune with his fingertip. The response was immediate. His elemental blood stirred as energy surged between his stone-touched nature and the marker. A pulse of power rippled through the ground, momentarily illuminating a line of similar stones half buried in the undergrowth. The sight stirred something in his memory, like an echo of knowledge not quite forgotten. The battle hymn rose in his throat, soft and low at first. As certain notes left his lips, specific runes on the marker began to glow in response. The pattern tugged at his thoughts, reminding him of the wayfinding songs his mercenary unit had used to navigate treacherous mountain passes. But where those had been designed to guide warriors to tactical positions, these runes sang of sanctuary and safe passage. Draven pressed his palm flat against the cool stone, extending his awareness into the earth below. The network of ley lines he detected wasn't random. They connected each marker in an intricate pattern, forming what felt like a vast protective circuit. The energy flowing through these ancient pathways had purpose, directing and shielding those who knew how to read the signs. A few paces ahead, another marker caught his eye. This one had fallen completely onto its side, nearly swallowed by the forest floor. Using his stone-shaping ability with delicate precision, Draven coaxed the earth away from the buried face. The runes here were different from the first marker, but no less potent. Where the previous stone spoke of guidance, these symbols resonated with pure protection. Despite 50 years of abandonment, their magic remained active, humming with potential. His elemental nature resonated with the unveiled runes, sending ripples of recognition through his stone-like skin as the moonlit herb's glow steadied into a constant, gentle radiance. The forest around him felt different now, less wild, more ordered, as if he'd stumbled upon the remnants of an ancient garden that still remembered its purpose. Draven ran his fingers over the protective runes again, feeling how they connected to the ley lines below. The magic here wasn't aggressive or militant, despite its strength. Instead, it reminded him of the way he'd learned to use his own powers differently after leaving his mercenary life behind, not as weapons, but as tools for shelter and safety. The herb in his palm pulsed once more, drawing his attention to a particular sequence of symbols near the base of the fallen marker. These runes were smaller than the others, easily missed if you weren't looking carefully. But as Draven studied them, he realized they formed instructions, not just for following the path, but for maintaining the protective network itself. His stone sense tingled as he decoded the ancient script. Each marker wasn't just a waypoint, it was part of a larger system designed to create a safe haven in these woods. The ley lines carried more than just magical energy. They transported intention, purpose, and most surprisingly, welcome. The entire network felt like an invitation waiting to be accepted. The battle hymn shifted in his mind again, its martial rhythms softening into something that felt more like a hearth song, the kind sung not to remember victories, but to celebrate coming home. As the melody wound through his thoughts, the runes responded, their glow strengthening and weakening in time with certain phrases. It was as if the stones themselves were trying to teach him their song. Draven retrieved a weathered journal from his pack, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. With practiced efficiency, he began sketching the rune configurations, noting how the moonlit herb's glow intensified near certain combinations. His fingers, calloused from years of wielding weapons, now moved with surprising delicacy as he documented each pattern. "Third quadrant triggers the strongest reaction," he muttered, marking the observation with the same precision he'd once used to map enemy positions. The herb pulsed brightest when held near runes depicting shelter and protection, dimming slightly when moved toward symbols of warning or concealment. A sudden warmth from his stone-forged ring drew his attention. The simple band had begun to emit a low, resonant hum that seemed to call to something buried in the earth. Before he could step back, the ground shifted beneath his feet, not violently, but with deliberate purpose. A third marker rose from the soil like a flower seeking sunlight, its emergence accompanied by the gentle cascade of falling earth rather than the grinding of stone he'd expected. The marker settled into position with quiet dignity, its runes already gleaming with welcome. This wasn't the aggressive deployment of a defensive measure, but rather the graceful awakening of a long-dormant guardian. Draven recognized the difference immediately. He'd seen enough weapons spring to life to know this was something else entirely. Following his instincts, he pressed his palm against the newly risen stone. The connection formed instantly, flooding his awareness with impressions from countless travelers who'd passed this way before. Their experiences echoed through the stone, exhaustion giving way to relief, fear softening into hope, tension melting into peace. Each memory carried the same thread of desperate seeking and eventual sanctuary. "So that's why," Draven whispered, understanding dawning as he sensed how the marker's magic wove together. The network created more than just a path, it formed a barrier that kept darker influences at bay. This explained the marked difference between this protected area and the wild forest beyond. Here, under Silvara's watch and the marker's protection, the very air felt cleaner, more purposeful. His stone sense traced the barrier's reach, following its course toward what could only be the inn's location. The protection wasn't absolute, no barrier ever was, he knew that from experience. But it was persistent, resilient, and surprisingly adaptive. Like a living thing, it responded to threats by redirecting them rather than confronting them directly. The path led him to a clearing where a larger marker dominated the space, its surface more elaborately carved than the others. When he held the herb near its face, the plant's silvery light seemed to sink into the stone itself, illuminating details that had been invisible moments before. Draven's breath caught as the scene emerged. A familiar building surrounded by protective stones, its windows glowing with welcome. The Hearth Crust Inn depicted exactly as it appeared on his map, but here shown as the heart of something larger, a sanctuary whose protection extended far into the surrounding forest. Two paths diverged before him, each marked by its own line of stones. Draven held the herb over each in turn, noting how its glow changed. The right-hand path made the plant pulse steadily, but the left, when he moved the herb there, both it and his stone-forged ring resonated with unmistakable purpose. The stones along that route began to wake, each one kindling with a soft, blue-white luminescence that reminded him of starlight caught in crystal. The light seemed to recognize him, not as an intruder or even a guest, but as something more. The markers were responding to him as they would to a guardian, their magic harmonizing with his own stone-touched nature. Each step along the illuminated path felt like moving through a conversation held in light and stone, the markers acknowledging his presence with subtle changes in their glow. His battle hymn rose again, but this time it felt less like a song of war and more like a response to the marker's welcome. The notes aligned with the pulse of light from the stones, creating a rhythm that seemed to strengthen the barrier with each measure. Draven found himself slowing his pace to match this rhythm, his military training recognizing the importance of moving in time with magical resonance. The herb's glow had settled into a steady radiance now, its light merging with that of the markers to illuminate his chosen path. Each stone he passed seemed to wake more fully, their runes brightening as if greeting an old friend. The protection he sensed through his stone magic felt less like a fortress wall and more like a warm embrace, strong but gentle, firm but welcoming. This was nothing like the defensive formations he'd helped maintain during his mercenary days. Those had been designed to repel, to harm if necessary. But this network operated on different principles entirely. It didn't just protect through force, it nurtured, guided, and sheltered. The magic here wasn't about keeping enemies out so much as helping worthy travelers find their way in. Chapter 4. The Haunted Crossroads. Through the silvery mist, a structure emerged that made Draven's ring hum with recognition. The way station rose from the forest floor like a forgotten memory taking shape. Weathered stone steps leading to a humble shelter whose ivy-draped walls bore the patina of countless seasons. As he drew closer, the magical resonance beneath his feet intensified. His stone sense mapped out elaborate patterns of ley line energy converging under the foundation, more complex than any natural formation he'd encountered. The door opened with a whisper of ancient hinges. Inside, a single room held decades of stories etched into its walls. Names, dates, and desperate pleas for sanctuary covered nearly every surface. Some were carved with careful precision, others scratched hastily as if their authors had been fleeing something terrible. Draven ran his fingers over the markings, his stone sense revealing layer upon layer of older inscriptions beneath, like rings in a tree, each telling its own tale of seeking shelter. "Safe passage to those who follow," he read aloud, the words worn smooth by time. "May the stones guide your way." In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal that drew his attention immediately. Its surface bore a circular pattern of runes that matched those on his map with uncanny precision. As he approached, the air grew thick with whispers, not threatening but urgent. Ghostly voices of travelers long past echoed through the chamber, their words just beyond comprehension. Draven withdrew Silvara's charm from his pocket, its silvery light seeming to pulse in response to the pedestal's presence. Following an instinct he couldn't quite name, he placed it carefully at the center of the runic circle. The effect was immediate. The runes began to glow with a soft, pearl-like luminescence, and the whispers crystallized into clearer fragments. "Seek the paths beneath paths," one voice murmured, its tone carrying both warning and promise. Another responded, "The stones remember what flesh forgets." His ring thrummed against his wrists, urging him to deeper awareness. Draven closed his eyes and pressed his palms flat against the pedestal's surface, extending his stone sense downward. The ley line patterns revealed themselves like a tapestry woven in light, intricate knots and whirls of energy with the pedestal serving as their focal point. But the pattern wasn't complete. Several connections had broken over time, leaving gaps in what should have been a seamless flow of power. As he traced these patterns with his awareness, something shifted in the air around him. The temperature dropped slightly, and when he opened his eyes, the room was no longer empty. Spectral figures huddled in the corners, a family with small children, an elderly couple, a lone traveler with a pack full of books. Their forms were translucent but detailed, their presence somehow preserved in the very stone of the way station. Draven watched, transfixed, as one of the spectral travelers approached the pedestal. The figure, a woman in clothes that spoke of a century past, moved with purpose, placing something that looked like a token on the pedestal's surface. Her companions joined her, each adding their own offerings in a specific sequence. With each placement, the runes pulsed brighter until the entire room hummed with protective energy. The scene faded gradually, but its lesson remained clear. The pedestal wasn't just a focal point. It was a key that needed to be turned in precisely the right way. Draven studied the runic circle more carefully now, noting how certain symbols aligned with the broken ley line connections he'd sensed. His stone magic had always been more intuitive than studied, but here was a puzzle that required both understanding and instinct. He placed his hands on either side of Silvara's charm, feeling the way it resonated with both the pedestal and his elemental blood. His stone-touched skin hummed with recognition as the three magical sources created a harmony he could almost hear, like his battle hymns, but gentler, more focused on protection than conflict. Through this connection, he began to understand how the way station had served its purpose for so long. It wasn't just a shelter, but a nexus point in a larger network of protection, gathering power from those it sheltered and using that energy to guide others to safety. The whispers continued around him, but they felt less like echoes now and more like instructions. Each voice added another piece to the puzzle: how the ley lines should flow, how the runes needed to align, how the very stones of the way station yearned to remember their original purpose. His stone-touched skin hummed with recognition at these revelations, his inherited power harmonizing with the ancient magic of the place in a way that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. The battle hymn rose from deep in Draven's chest, a low, resonant tone that his grandmother had taught him years ago. As his voice filled the chamber, the ley line patterns beneath the floor flickered like starlight through water. Certain notes made specific connections pulse brighter, while others caused the broken pathways to shimmer with untapped potential. He adjusted his pitch, experimenting with different portions of the ancient song. When he hit a particularly deep note, one of the dormant ley lines flared briefly to life, its energy seeking its original path before fading again. His stone-like skin hummed with recognition, his elemental nature responding to the combination of voice and stone magic. "The paths remember," a whisper encouraged, barely audible beneath his singing. "Guide them home." Draven knelt beside the first broken connection, pressing his palm against the cool stone floor. Through his stone sense, he could feel the ley line's desire to flow properly again, like a stream longing for its original course. With careful concentration, he began to shape the stone, his inherited abilities allowing him to create a shallow channel that would help direct the magical energy. The work required precision. Too deep a channel would disperse the power, too shallow and it wouldn't hold the flow. He hummed specific phrases from the hymn as he worked, using the resonance to test each adjustment. The whispers grew more distinct, offering fragments of guidance. "Gentle curves," one murmured. "Let it breathe." "The stone knows," another added. "Trust its memory." As he shaped each channel, his stone sense detected traces of others who had solved this puzzle before him. Their magical signatures lingered in the stone like fingerprints, each one adding their own subtle variation to the way station's protection. A dwarf's precise geometric patterns, a geomancer's flowing curves, an earth elemental's crystalline structures. Their solutions had been different, but all had served the same purpose: guiding travelers to safety. Draven's own approach combined elements he'd learned through years of survival: the efficiency of a soldier's fortifications, the grace of natural stone formations, the protective instincts that had driven him to seek redemption. His stone sense grew stronger as he worked, his connection to the earth helping him shape the channels with increasing confidence. The final connection proved the most challenging. The ley line's energy was strongest here, resistant to being redirected. Draven deepened his humming, focusing on the most ancient verses of the battle hymn. These weren't the aggressive calls to combat, but older passages about protection and shelter. The stone responded to these tones, becoming more pliable under his touch. As he completed the last channel, the pedestal's runes erupted in brilliant light. The spectral images around him shifted and coalesced, forming a clear path through the forest. He saw stone markers half buried in moss, ancient trees with runes carved into their bark, and subtle signs that would guide him to the inn. Each landmark burned itself into his memory with supernatural clarity. Then the vision changed, showing him the Hearth and Crust Inn as it must have appeared decades ago. The way station's magic connected to a vast network of protective wards surrounding the inn, each shelter and safe house contributing to its strength. He saw travelers finding refuge, their gratitude and relief feeding back into the system, making it stronger. The inn stood as the heart of this network, and he felt the echo of its guardian's purpose resonate with something deep within himself. When the vision faded, Draven stood slowly, his legs stiff from kneeling. The whispers had grown quiet, but the air held a sense of anticipation. He approached one of the walls, finding a small empty space among the countless marks left by others. Instead of carving his name, he pressed his hand against the stone, letting his inherited magic flow naturally through his connection to Earth. A rune took shape beneath his fingers, not one he'd learned from any book, but one that emerged from his own experience of seeking and finally finding purpose. It combined elements of protection with the promise of guidance, his magic infusing it with the same steady strength he'd discovered within himself. As he stepped back, the rune settled into the wall's surface, adding its energy to the way station's centuries of accumulated sanctuary. The whispers stirred one final time, a chorus of approval that faded into comfortable silence. Draven retrieved Silvara's charm from the pedestal, noting how it now resonated with his elemental heritage. The ley lines flowed steady and strong beneath his feet, their restored patterns pointing him toward his destination. He had a clear path now, not just to the inn, but to the role that awaited him there. Draven settled into the ritual of making camp with methodical precision, each movement born from years of survival instinct. The two guardian stones loomed on either side of his chosen spot, their weathered surfaces etched with protective runes that hummed faintly against his stone sense. He positioned himself squarely between them, arranging his bedroll where the stone's ancient magic would overlap during the night. The familiar motions brought a different weight now. In his mercenary days, such careful positioning had been about defending against ambush. Tonight, it felt more like seeking shelter. Though from what, he wasn't entirely sure. The whispers from the way station still echoed in his mind, making the forest feel more alive than threatening. As he coaxed the campfire to life, the dancing flames cast shifting shadows across his arms. The stone-like sheen of his skin caught the light oddly, highlighting the network of scars that marked his past. His fingers traced unconsciously over 3 parallel lines on his forearm, each ridge deep enough to interrupt the natural patterns in his stone-touched flesh. The memory they carried made his jaw clench, not from the pain of receiving them, but from what came after. The fire settled into a steady burn, and Draven found himself studying his stone-forged ring. It had become almost an extension of himself these past weeks, channeling his elemental nature in a way that made his previous restraints seem like crude shackles in comparison. Still, it needed cleaning, and he couldn't ignore the task forever. With careful movements, he slipped the ring from his finger. The firelight immediately caught the scarring beneath, angry marks where binding runes had once been seared into his flesh. Similar scars traced up his forearms, though these patterns were more chaotic, as if the bindings had been burned away in a violent release of his stone-touched power. He set the ring aside with more care than strictly necessary, resisting the urge to immediately replace it. The night air felt strange against his exposed forearms. Vulnerable, he focused on maintaining the fire, trying to ignore how the shadows seemed to deepen around the edges of his camp. An old battle hymn rose naturally to his lips, its familiar rhythm steadying his hands as he worked. But as the melody continued, it began to shift. The protective verses gave way to darker songs, ones sung around different fires with different companions, the kind of songs that made light of violence and celebrated the power to destroy rather than defend. He caught himself mid-verse, the words dying in his throat as he recognized the change. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Sleep approached like a reluctant ally, keeping its distance until exhaustion finally won out. As his consciousness faded, the Guardian Stone's magic wrapped around him like a blanket, their protection carrying him into dreams. He stood before massive fortress gates, their stone surface thrumming with defensive enchantments he could feel in his bones. Familiar faces surrounded him, Kara with her quicksilver daggers, Marcus and his booming laugh, Sarah's quiet competence, his team, his trusted companions. The air crackled with anticipation, that peculiar tension before a storm breaks. "Just like old times," Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. But something was wrong. The weight of his hand felt like a betrayal waiting to happen. The scene twisted. Stone magic erupted from deep within him, raw and uncontrolled. The fortress walls, meant to keep enemies out, became weapons in his hands. But he couldn't direct it, couldn't protect those who deserved protection. His power responded only to rage and pain, tearing through stone and flesh without discrimination. He heard Kara scream his name, warning or accusation, he couldn't tell. Sarah's quiet voice turned desperate. Marcus's laugh became something else entirely. The fortress collapsed around them, his magic pulling the stones apart at their very seams, and he could do nothing but watch as... Draven jerked awake, his stone-touched blood surging beneath his skin before he'd fully surfaced from the nightmare. The fire had burned low, its embers casting just enough light to reveal the protective circle still intact between the guardian stones. His fingers found his stone-forged ring where it lay beside him, its presence grounding him in the present moment. The forest night continued its quiet symphony around him. Wind in leaves, distant owl calls, the subtle pulse of ley lines beneath the earth. No chaos, no screams, no betrayal. Just the weight of memory, heavy as stone. He slipped the ring back on, feeling his elemental power settle as it reconnected with the stone's crystalline core. The ring no longer sought to contain his abilities, but rather helped focus and direct them. Still, as he watched the dying embers, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fortress gates in his dream had looked remarkably similar to the ones he'd glimpsed in his vision of the inn. "It's not personal, Ironroot." Marcus's voice slithered through the darkness of memory. "The client pays double for elemental blood." Kara's whisper followed, sharp as her blades. "Just hold still." "It'll be easier that way." Draven's eyes snapped open. Before his conscious mind fully registered the pre-dawn darkness, his power had already surged through the earth. Rough stone walls erupted around his camp in a defensive circle, their surfaces jagged with the rawness of his fear. The abrupt silence that followed seemed to mock his reaction. There were no assassins here, no betrayers lying in wait. Just shadows and memories. He pressed his palms against the nearest stone barrier, feeling the tremor of power still coursing through it. The surface was uneven, almost savage in its formation. Nothing like the precise, purposeful structures he'd learned to craft since then. With careful concentration, he smoothed the stone's surface, transforming its threatening spikes into gentle curves. The action helped steady his breathing, grounding him in the present moment. The dying embers of his fire cast just enough light to illuminate his stone-forged ring. Draven traced the faintly glowing green veins that coursed through its crystalline core, their pattern so different from the binding runes that had once been burned into his flesh. Unlike those cruel markings that had sought to contain his elemental nature, the ring served as a willing partnership between his blood and stone, a choice, not a cage. From his pack, he withdrew a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The contents shifted with a sound like falling sand as he opened it. In the dim light, the mixture of ash and stone fragments looked almost ordinary. It was hard to believe they were all that remained of a fortress's grand gates, all that remained of his last mission as a mercenary. He let a few fragments trickle through his fingers, feeling their residual magic. Even now, years later, they resonated with the echo of his unleashed power. The moment when betrayal had shattered not just his trust, but his careful control. Stone that should have protected had become a weapon of indiscriminate destruction. The fragments served as a tangible reminder of what happened when rage overwhelmed restraint. As he returned the pouch to his pack, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Draven settled into a cross-legged position between the guardian stones, their ancient magic a steady presence at his back. He closed his eyes, focusing on the pulse of ley lines beneath the earth. Their rhythm was different here than in the places he'd traveled before. Steadier, somehow. More purposeful. Each beat of power helped align his breathing, washing away the lingering tension from his nightmare. The ley lines didn't judge or demand. They simply existed, offering their strength to those who knew how to channel it. Like the stone itself, they could be used to protect or destroy. The choice lay in the wielder's intent. Inhale. Power flowed up through the earth, raw and potent. Exhale. It settled into patterns of protection and stability. Inhale. The memory of destruction. Exhale. The promise of sanctuary. When Draven finally opened his eyes, true dawn had arrived. He dismantled his defensive walls with careful precision, returning each stone to its proper place beneath the soil. No trace remained of his night terror's violent response. As he gathered his belongings, his movements were measured and calm, each action infused with renewed purpose. Before departing, he knelt beside the guardian stones. With gentle manipulation of his power, he created a small marker, a simple pillar about knee height, its surface smooth and inviting to the touch. He traced protective runes into its surface, but unlike the aggressive warnings he would have left in his mercenary days, these spoke of safety and rest. The marker would serve as a beacon for other travelers, suggesting shelter rather than threatening danger. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once, he would have marked his territory to keep others away. Now, he found himself creating signs to guide them toward sanctuary. The transformation felt right, like stones settling into their proper places after an avalanche. The morning sun caught the green glow of his stone-forged ring as he shouldered his pack. His stone-touched blood stirred in harmony with the ley lines below, the ring's crystalline core helping focus what had once run wild, reminding him that power could be channeled through choice rather than constraint. He had been a weapon once, honed for destruction. But weapons could be reformed, their edges smoothed, their purpose redirected. The path ahead beckoned, and Draven moved forward with the steady patience of stone. Each step carried him further from the fortress's ash, and closer to whatever awaited at the inn. The old battle hymn rose to his lips again, but this time he let it fade naturally, replacing it with the quiet rhythm of his boots against the earth. Chapter 5. The Hearth Beckons. Through the morning mist, the Hearth and Crust Inn emerged like a memory taking solid form. Draven's steps slowed as he studied the two-story stone building, its ivy-draped walls lending an air of ancient permanence to the structure. His stone-touched blood stirred with recognition, and through his inherited connection to the earth, he sensed what lay beneath. Not one ley line, but several, converging in a complex weave under the foundation. The power thrummed through the ground like deep music, familiar yet distinct from any he'd encountered before. The scent reached him next. Fresh bread, rich and inviting, carrying hints of honey and herbs. Draven's brow furrowed as he reconciled the aroma with the inn's weathered exterior. Shuttered windows and creeping vegetation suggested abandonment, but his stone sense told a different story. Subtle vibrations through the ground spoke of recent movement within, though no smoke rose from the chimney. No faces peered through windows. He paused at the edge of the front garden, where wilderness met cultivation in an intriguing dance. At first glance, the space appeared overgrown, but his mercenary's eye caught the deliberate patterns. Herbs grew in concentric circles, their placement too precise to be accidental. Fresh cuts marked recently pruned branches, the wood still sticky with sap. Draven knelt to examine a cluster of silvery leaves, recognizing Shadowbane, a rare herb prized for its protective properties. Beside it grew healing thistle and wardroot, their leaves arranged to catch the morning light. The garden's design spoke of someone who understood both plants and protection, though they clearly preferred subtle defenses to obvious barriers. different from his own instincts perhaps, but no less effective. As he approached the entrance, the door's craftsmanship drew his attention. Intricate patterns flowed across the wood like frozen rivers, and his fingers found familiar runes nestled within the design. They matched those on his map, though here they seemed more alive somehow. The wood felt warm beneath his touch, almost responsive, humming gently against his calloused fingertips. Not mere decoration, then, but active enchantment. Draven crouched to examine the foundation stones, drawn by a glimmer that echoed the sheen of his own skin. Crystalline veins threaded through the granite, catching light in ways that stone shouldn't. He recognized the work immediately, the precise angles, the seamless joins, the way each block channeled rather than blocked the ley line energy below. This was stone elemental craftsmanship, from an age when his ancestors had raised monuments that lasted millennia. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Through one dusty window, he glimpsed what appeared to be a chair sliding across the floor of its own accord, as if making room at an empty table. A bench shifted position, and a small side table rotated slightly. The instant his gaze focused directly on them, everything went still. The furniture stood innocent and motionless, as if it had never dreamed of moving itself. Draven straightened slowly, his stone sense tingling with recognition. The inn was clearly more than it appeared. Much like himself, perhaps. Its defenses were subtle but layered. The protective herbs, the runed door, the ancient foundation stones. Even the seemingly playful furniture suggested a place that was very much alive and aware, regardless of its dormant appearance. The scent of fresh bread wafted stronger now, accompanied by a hint of cinnamon. His elemental nature resonated with the ley lines below, and the door's runes seemed to shine just a bit brighter, as if responding to his presence. All his instincts, honed through years of survival, told him this place was safe, not despite its strangeness, but because of it. He stood before the door, feeling the weight of the moment. The inn waited, neither welcoming nor rejecting, but watchful. Through his connection to stone, Draven sensed the building's patience. Like the earth itself, it had all the time in the world to wait for the right person to cross its threshold. Draven's boots left clear impressions in the thick dust coating the porch boards, each step a stark reminder of how long the inn had stood empty. Yet the brass door handle caught his eye, gleaming with a polish that seemed impossible given the general state of neglect. He'd seen similar contradictions before. Illusion magic meant to discourage casual observers. His fingers traced the metal's surface, finding it solid and cool to the touch, undeniably real despite its incongruous shine. An old Orcish battle hymn rose unbidden to his thoughts, and he hummed the low, resonant notes. The sound vibrated through his chest and into the stone walls, drawing an unexpected response. With each note, different patterns of magic illuminated within the masonry. First, a lattice of protective wards near the foundation, then sweeping arcs of preservation spells higher up. The third verse revealed channels carved into the stone itself, designed to direct and amplify magical energy. The complexity of it all made his soldier's mind appreciate the tactical brilliance. This wasn't just a building. It was a fortress disguised as an inn. Movement caught his attention, a warm, golden glow from a second-floor window. Draven's gaze snapped upward, but found only darkness behind shuttered glass. Still, his connection to the stone told him something had stirred up there. The floor vibrations echoed with phantom footsteps, as if memories of past inhabitants were replaying themselves through the structure. The sensation wasn't threatening, merely expectant. He pressed his palm against the door, and it swung inward with a drawn-out creak. A rush of warm air enveloped him, carrying scents that made no sense given the inn's abandoned appearance. Fresh bread, definitely baked within the hour. Herbs, sage, rosemary, and others he couldn't name. And threading through it all, the distinctive tang of active magic, sharp and clean like the air before a storm. Draven had smelled enough magical workshops to recognize power being actively channeled, not just residual enchantments. The threshold itself seemed to welcome him. His elemental blood stirred, his stone-forged ring brightening to cast green-tinged shadows on the weathered doorframe. His inherited power resonated with the inn's magic, responding less like a defensive barrier and more like a recognition, an acknowledgement. The sensation reminded him of greeting a fellow soldier with a clasped arm, formal but friendly, one warrior to another. As he stepped inside, the door closed behind him with a gentle click, moving on its own but making no effort to hide its animation. The darkness that had seemed absolute from outside lifted gradually, like a theater's curtain being drawn back. The common room emerged from shadow in stages, presenting a scene that made Draven blink and look again. A massive hearth dominated one wall, and within it, embers glowed with stubborn warmth, sending occasional sparks dancing upward. The heat they produced felt real enough against his face, yet they cast no light beyond the fireplace itself. Tables and chairs were arranged with the precise spacing of a working tavern, though thick dust draped their surfaces like gray silk. A bar stood against the far wall, its polished surface immaculate in some spots while gathering dust in others, as if someone had been cleaning it in patches. The contradictions continued everywhere he looked. A row of mugs hung from ceiling hooks, some coated in dust, others gleaming as if freshly washed. The floorboards beneath his feet were scratched and worn from years of traffic, yet they creaked with an almost musical note when he shifted his weight, as if the wood itself was trying to speak. Draven's stone sense tingled constantly now, registering the ley lines that converged beneath the foundation. Their energy rose through the floor in visible ripples, like heat waves off sun-baked rock, distorting his view of the room's darker corners. The power felt neither chaotic nor dangerous. Instead, it moved with purpose, as if following channels carved by centuries of careful use. A beam of sunlight broke through one shutter, illuminating dust motes that danced in patterns too organized to be natural. As Draven watched, they swirled into what might have been words before dispersing. The air itself seemed thick with waiting, with possibility. Every warrior instinct he'd developed over years of survival told him he stood in a place of power, not the raw, violent kind he'd known in battle, but something older and more subtle. Power that had chosen to wait, to watch, to welcome when the moment was right. His elemental nature awakened, falling into rhythm with the ley lines below. The resonance traveled through his stone-touched skin and settled in his chest, feeling remarkably like coming home. Draven stood motionless as candles flickered to life around the common room, their flames dancing in perfect synchronization. The warm light caught the crystalline sheen of his stone-touched skin, creating a shimmer that reminded him of sunlight on river stones. His inherited power pulsed steadily, matching a rhythm he could feel through the soles of his boots. The inn's magical heartbeat, as regular as a soldier's march. The massive hearth drew his attention like a lodestone, its dying embers stirred without a breath of wind, orange sparks swirling upward in deliberate spirals. As he approached, the fire rekindled itself, flames springing up from ash with a soft whoosh. The sudden illumination revealed stonework that made his breath catch. Intricate patterns were carved into the hearth's facade, not just decorative swirls, but the ancient runes of his people, the marks of earth speakers and stone shapers. Some were worn smooth by centuries of heat, while others remained sharp enough to read protection, sanctuary, welcome. His boots creaked against the wooden floorboards, each step producing a specific note. The sound tugged at his memory until he recognized the pattern. It matched the rhythm of an old orcish battle hymn, one his grandmother had taught him. Without thinking, he hummed a few bars of the melody, the deep notes resonating in his chest. The inn responded, walls and beams and stone all vibrating in harmony. The sound wrapped around him like an embrace, and for the first time since leaving his clan, the hymn didn't taste of ashes in his mouth. Movement caught his eye, a leather-bound book on a side table, its pages turning by themselves. Draven approached cautiously, noting how the book's weathered cover bore no title, just the impression of countless hands. As he watched, the pages settled on a blank spread that wasn't blank for long. Ink blossomed across the paper in various hands. Warnings, welcomes, riddles, and snippets of conversation. Some entries faded even as he read them, while others remained clear. Then, in the bottom corner, fresh words began forming in elegant script. Welcome, Guardian. The title sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. His stone sense expanded involuntarily, reaching deep beneath the floorboards to where ley lines crisscrossed in complex patterns. Each magical current flowed with purpose, forming a web of protective enchantments with the hearth at its center. As his awareness brushed against them, the ley lines brightened, their power surging in response to his presence. The sensation reminded him of patrol dogs recognizing a familiar scent. There was intelligence in that response, and acceptance. A scraping sound pulled him from his reverie. A chair at a nearby table had pulled itself out, angled in clear invitation. Draven's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. After years of reading battlefields and ambush sites, he'd developed a healthy suspicion of obvious invitations. But his stone sense detected no threat, only that same welcoming resonance that had greeted him at the door. He settled into the chair, which adjusted itself with small creaks and shifts until it perfectly accommodated his broader-than-human frame. The table followed suit, its surface rising slightly to rest at precisely the right height. From a shelf behind the bar, a teacup detached itself and floated over, accompanied by a matching saucer. They settled before him with a gentle clink, the cup already steaming with what smelled like his favorite blend of mountain herbs. Draven wrapped his hands around the warm cup, feeling the inn's magic resonate with his elemental blood. The sensation wasn't invasive or demanding. Instead, it felt like the structure was introducing itself, sharing its story through the ancient language of stone that had been his birthright. Here was age without weakness, power without aggression, protection without pride. Everything he'd sought and failed to find in his years of mercenary work. The teacup clinked softly against its saucer as he lifted it for a sip. The herbs were exactly right, of course. The same blend his grandmother used to brew after training sessions, when young warriors needed reminding that strength could serve peace as well as war. He wondered if the inn had pulled that knowledge from his memories, or if it simply knew what its guardian needed. Guardian. The word settled into his thoughts like a key finding its lock. The inn's magic thrummed in agreement, its rhythm perfectly matched to his own. As Draven set down his empty cup, wisps of steam curled upward in deliberate patterns. His eyes narrowed, recognizing the same runes that had drawn him here, not random swirls of vapor, but precise magical script hanging in the air. His elemental nature responded as each symbol formed, the curved line of protection, the nested circles of sanctuary, the branching paths of guidance, the same marks that decorated his weathered map, now dancing in the space between teacup and ceiling. The scent of fresh bread pulled him from his contemplation, rich and yeasty and entirely too recent to belong in an abandoned inn. Following his nose and the gentle creaking of floorboards that seemed to encourage his steps, Draven made his way to the kitchen. The space was immaculate, copper pots gleaming on their hooks, wooden spoons arranged by size, and there, cooling on rack after rack, loaves of bread that couldn't be more than an hour old. He approached the nearest rack, stone-touched fingers hovering over the golden-brown crust. Each loaf bore familiar markings, the same runes he'd been tracking scored deliberately into the surface before baking. Not decoration, but purpose. His grandmother had taught him that anything could be a vessel for magic if crafted with intention. Even bread, it seemed, could carry ancient protections. Movement in the kitchen's shadows caught his attention, but not in a way that triggered his combat instincts. The darkness itself was responding to his presence, drawing back like curtains being pulled aside. In those retreating shadows he glimpsed moments from the inn's past, spectral images of laughing patrons, busy cooks, travelers finding refuge from storms both natural and magical. The visions lasted only seconds, but they carried the weight of truth. This place had been more than an inn. It had been a sanctuary. His stone-touched blood stirred, drawing his attention to a particular stone in the kitchen wall. Nothing marked it as special to the eye, but his elemental senses told a different story. The block resonated with stored magic, harmonizing with the ley lines beneath the foundation. When he pressed his palm against it, the stone recognized him. Ancient magic flowed through his inherited connection, unlocking something deep within the wall. The stones rearranged themselves without a sound, revealing a chamber that had waited decades to be discovered. His stone sense mapped the space before his eyes adjusted to its depths. Shelves lined with artifacts, each humming with protective enchantments, crystals that could power defensive wards, metals marked with binding runes, tools for working earth magic that made his elemental blood sing in recognition. The chamber wasn't just a storage room, it was an armory for whoever guarded the inn. Behind him, the kitchen continued its subtle rearrangement. Chairs scraped across floors, tables shifted positions, cupboards opened and closed in sequence. The movements weren't random. The inn was organizing itself according to some internal blueprint, preparing for service. A knife block rotated to present its handles more conveniently. A heavy cooking pot positioned itself near the hearth, ready for use. Each item found its perfect place, and through his connection to the foundation, Draven understood he was watching the inn wake from a long sleep. Twilight painted the windows in deep purples and blues, but darkness never fully claimed the inn's interior. Lanterns sparked to life along the walls, their flames steady and warm. The light revealed more changes. Fresh linens on tables, cushions plumped and arranged invitingly, surfaces gleaming as though recently polished. Through his feet, Draven felt the building's magic rise like sap in spring, spreading through stone and wood and metal. The sensation reminded him of a cat stretching after a long nap, every part of the inn extending and settling into its proper place. The magic curled around him too, testing, measuring, approving. His stone sense translated the inn's wordless communication. He was known, he was accepted, he was needed. The weight of guardianship settled across his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle he'd been shaped to wear. The inn's power harmonized with his own, earth magic singing in his blood as it hadn't since before his exile. A final pulse of magic rippled through the foundation, and Draven felt the inn's defenses snap fully awake. Wards sparkled momentarily in doorways and windows. Protective runes glowed briefly on walls and lintels. The hearthfire burned higher, casting light and warmth into every corner. The building had transformed from an abandoned shell into a living sanctuary, and through his deep connection to its stones, Draven knew he had transformed with it. Draven's boots whispered against the worn floorboards as he entered the kitchen, his attention drawn to the copper pots swaying ever so slightly on their hooks. No windows were open, no draft stirred the air, yet the pots continued their gentle dance. Years of mercenary work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts told him he wasn't alone. He ran a calloused finger along the kitchen counter, noting how meticulously clean everything was despite the inn's apparent abandonment. A wooden spoon caught his eye, not because of its well-worn handle or the careful way it had been placed, but because it hadn't been there a moment ago. As he turned to examine the cooling racks of fresh bread, the spoon slid 3 inches to the left, its movement as deliberate as a chess piece advancing. Through his connection to the stone foundation, Draven felt tiny vibrations, too rhythmic to be settling wood, too purposeful to be random. Something was moving around him, light-footed, but not quite weightless. He reached for a jar of dried herbs, pretending to study its label while using its polished surface to observe the kitchen behind him. A cupboard door eased shut with painful slowness, as if trying not to draw attention to itself. His elemental nature awakened, responding to a magical signature that felt different from the inn's ambient energy. This was more focused, more conscious. He hummed a few bars of an old Orcish battle hymn, letting it resonate with his stone-touched blood. The sound bounced oddly in places where there should have been clear air, creating acoustic shadows around empty spaces that weren't quite empty. "Interesting technique," he murmured, mostly to himself, though he noted how the kitchen's subtle movements paused at the sound of his voice. The ceramic tea jar on the counter had been left open, and when he glanced away, he caught the leaves rearranging themselves in his peripheral vision. The pattern they formed was familiar, similar to the guidance runes he'd followed through the forest, but with a different inflection. If he was reading them correctly, they spelled something like "welcome" or perhaps "sanctuary." His stone sense picked up more movement, light impressions in the floorboards that appeared and vanished like footprints in sand. Whatever was watching him could affect the physical world, but preferred to remain unseen. Draven continued his quiet humming, using the battle hymn's rhythm to track the invisible presence as it circled the kitchen. The knife block on the counter rotated 5 degrees clockwise, then snapped back to its original position when he turned to look at it directly. But in that brief movement, he'd caught something clever. The knives had been arranged so their polished surfaces reflected light into specific corners of the kitchen. Those corners, he noticed, aligned perfectly with the protective runes carved into the walls. "You've gone to a lot of trouble to set this up," he said, keeping his tone conversational as he leaned against the counter. His stone-touched blood stirred steadily now, mapping the distinct threads of magical energy around him. "The bread is fresh, the knives are positioned just so, and everything's clean enough to pass a military inspection." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the watchful silence. "But you're not ready to show yourself yet, are you?" A pot lid rattled softly, not in answer, he suspected, but in reaction to his directness. The invisible presence had withdrawn slightly, gathering in the corners where the knife reflections touched the walls. Through the stone beneath his feet, Draven felt the subtle shift in pressure as whatever watched him considered its next move. He pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down, deliberately making himself less imposing. The chair was positioned perfectly, as though it had been waiting for him. "That's all right," he said, his low voice carrying clearly in the attentive quiet. "I've learned patience the hard way. And this—" he gestured to the kitchen with its careful arrangements and hidden purpose. "This feels like a place worth waiting for." The tea leaves shifted again, forming a new pattern. This time they held their shape long enough for him to read them clearly. "Safe haven for those who understand waiting." His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, teaching him about patience, about how some magics needed to be earned rather than claimed. He settled deeper into the chair, his stone-touched blood still and watchful now, but aware of the presence that moved like thought through the kitchen's shadows. Draven kept his breathing steady as he studied the copper pan hanging near the hearth. Its polished surface revealed more than just his own reflection. Quick flickers of movement darted behind him, there and gone like minnows in a stream. The shapes were small, perhaps waist height, and moved with practiced coordination. One would duck behind a counter just as another slipped between shadows cast by the drying herbs. His stone sense picked up the faintest vibrations through the floorboards, light, precise steps that suggested his observers were well practiced at moving unseen. A dusting of flour on the counter caught his attention as tiny handprints appeared, no larger than a child's, before being meticulously smoothed away. More prints materialized near the bread, creating a pattern that reminded him of supply inventory marks he'd seen in merchant caravans. The air shifted around him, patches of warmth and cool dancing through the kitchen like scattered sunlight. His ring responded differently to each presence. A gentle hum for the one near the pantry, a sharp tingle for another by the window, a deep resonance for something that moved between the ceiling beams. The varying magical signatures suggested he wasn't dealing with a single type of being, but rather a coordinated group of different magical folk. "Dropped something," he muttered, deliberately letting a wooden spoon slip from his fingers. It clattered against the floorboards and he waited, keeping his posture relaxed. After a moment, the spoon scraped softly against the wood, sliding toward his feet in small, careful movements. The gesture carried a tentative kindness that eased some of the tension in his shoulders. Steam rose from the cooling loaves of bread, curling into shapes that cast strange shadows on the wall. Draven recognized signals in those shadows, not the military hand signs he knew from his mercenary days, but something more ancient. Two shadow shapes merged briefly, forming what looked like a question mark before separating into parallel lines. Another shadow answered with a spiral that unwound into 3 dots, a response that drew soft rustling sounds from several corners of the kitchen. A chair scraped against the floor behind him, positioning itself at what his stone sense told him was precisely the same distance from 3 different corners of the room. An invitation, then, but also a test. The placement would put his back to the pantry while giving him clear views of both the hearth and the window. Instead of taking the offered seat, Draven leaned his hip against the counter, keeping his hands visible and his stance loose despite his imposing height. He chose a spot that let him monitor the areas where he'd detected the most movement while ensuring he didn't loom over the shorter presences he'd glimpsed. "The bread smells like my grandmother's recipe," he said, his low voice gentle in the watchful quiet. "She used to add rosemary and just a touch of honey." The steam shadows flickered at his words, and one of the copper pots swayed slightly, its surface catching a reflection of something that might have been a pointed ear or the edge of a tiny apron. His stone sense stirred as the magical energies in the room shifted, converging and separating like leaves in a breeze. The temperature variations became more distinct. A warm spot near his elbow felt like sunlight, while a cool draft by his ankles carried the crisp scent of fresh linen. Another presence, marked by the scent of cinnamon and old books, moved from the pantry to the window in a series of quick, silent steps. More flower patterns appeared on the counter, forming what looked like a debate in progress. One set of marks would appear, be quickly brushed away, only to be replaced by a different arrangement. Through the stone beneath his feet, Draven felt the subtle weight shifts as his hidden observers repositioned themselves, their movements suggesting some sort of deliberation. The copper pots swayed again, their rhythm matching the old orcish melody he'd been humming earlier. He noticed how the shadows cast by the steam now moved in time with the tune, and the temperature variations pulsed gently with each measure. Whatever these beings were, they responded to music, not with fear or aggression, but with what felt like curiosity. A fresh wave of bread scent wafted through the kitchen, carrying hints of herbs he hadn't noticed before. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Patience reveals more than force ever could." He remained still, watching the play of shadows and light, feeling the subtle shifts in magic through his ring, and waiting for his hidden observers to reach their decision. Chapter 6. A Brownie's Challenge. Jill had been watching the stone-touched orc for nearly 10 minutes, and she had to admit, he was far more interesting than the usual riffraff who stumbled into her kitchen. Most intruders poked around like nervous mice or stomped about breaking things. This one moved with purpose, his amber eyes taking in every detail while his massive frame somehow avoided disturbing even a single pot or pan. "Caught you looking," her enchanted t-shirt proclaimed as she materialized on her favorite high shelf, letting her legs swing freely in the air. Her pigtails bounced as she tilted her head, studying him with unabashed curiosity. The faint, stone-like sheen of his skin caught the kitchen's warm light, making him look like a statue come to life. "Well, you're much more stony than our usual trespassers," she announced, her toolkit jingling merrily as she hopped from shelf to shelf. Each landing was precise, practiced, a dance she'd perfected over countless security inspections. Her movements created a deliberate circle around the orc, though she noted with approval that he didn't spin frantically to track her. "Not that we get many trespassers. Well, not many who make it this far anyway." The orc remained still, his posture relaxed, despite her circling. Interesting. Most folks got twitchy when a brownie started bouncing around them. As she completed another circuit, she caught sight of the crystalline sheen of his skin, and the gentle pulse of elemental magic emanating from him made her eyebrows shoot up. Her t-shirt shifted to display "Security Inspection in Progress" as she withdrew her favorite magnifying glass, comically oversized for her small hands but perfect for proper investigating. She peered through it at his stone-forged ring, her playful grin softening into genuine fascination. The stone magic was exquisite, with ancient patterns that spoke of protection and guidance. "That's proper Earth Guardian magic, or I'm a garden gnome," she declared, wiggling her fingers to summon one of her tiny air elementals. The wispy creature materialized with a cheerful chime, circling Draven's head like a curious bird. It paused in front of his face, crossing its vaporous arms and adopting his stoic expression in perfect mimicry. A smile tugged at the orc's lips, small, but definitely there. Jill's t-shirt immediately changed to "Clever, isn't he?" as she noted how his gaze had already picked out 3 of her carefully concealed security mechanisms: the pressure plate under the loose floorboard, the tripwire disguised as a stray piece of twine, even the enchanted cookie jar that would shower any unauthorized snacker with rainbow sparkles. "You've got quite the eye," she admitted, swinging her legs a bit faster. "Most folks miss the cookie jar completely, though I suppose your elemental heritage helps you sense the magic." She produced a cookie from one of her many pockets and took a deliberate bite. "Don't worry, this one's from my personal stash. I'm not about to sparkle bomb myself." The air elemental, apparently deciding that mimicry was its new favorite game, produced a tiny spectral cookie and pretended to munch on it. Jill couldn't help but giggle at its antics, even as she maintained her strategic position above the orc. "So," she continued, brushing crumbs from her patchwork dress, "since you're clearly not your average wanderer, what with that stone-forged ring and that rather impressive earth magic I felt earlier, maybe we should properly introduce ourselves." She gestured to another of her mechanical traps, this one cleverly disguised as an ordinary butter churn. "Unless you'd prefer to keep admiring my handiwork, I do have quite a few more surprises scattered about." The air elemental abandoned its cookie pantomime to inspect Draven's hair, attempting to create a spectral version of his tied-back style. Jill watched the orc's reactions carefully, noting how he allowed the elemental's proximity without tension. Her t-shirt shifted again, now reading "Promising Candidate," though she quickly crossed her arms over it before the words became too visible. This one was different. She could feel it in her bones, the same way she could sense a mechanism that needed fixing or a charm that needed adjusting. The question was, different in a good way, or in a way that would require her more creative security measures? Jill studied the orc with growing curiosity as he continued his careful observation of her kitchen. There was something different about this one, something that made her enchanted tools hum with interest. Wrenchy, in particular, seemed downright enthusiastic, vibrating against her hip with an eagerness she rarely felt from the usually stoic tool. "Wrenchy thinks you might be all right," she announced, patting the wrench affectionately. Its metallic surface warmed beneath her touch, humming a note that sounded suspiciously like agreement. With practiced casualness, though anyone who knew her would recognize the deliberate nature of her accidents, she let Wrenchy slip from her grasp. The enchanted tool clattered to the floor near Draven's feet. Her heart did a little skip as she watched him respond. Most visitors either ignored, dropped tools entirely, or snatched them up carelessly, but the orc's movements were measured, respectful. His large hands, despite their obvious strength, cradled Wrenchy with surprising gentleness. He even took a moment to examine the delicate runes she'd etched along the handle before offering it back. Her t-shirt rippled, letters rearranging themselves to read, "Tool respect equals good character," as warmth bloomed in her chest. "Well, well," she murmured, accepting Wrenchy back with a small nod. "You certainly know how to treat a lady's tools." Feeling emboldened, Jill reached into one of her countless pockets, the 7th one on the left, to be precise, where she kept her most interesting mechanical bits. Her fingers closed around a small gear she'd enhanced with a mixture of brownie magic and good old-fashioned tinkering. The metal caught the light as she tossed it in a gentle arc toward their visitor. The moment Draven caught the gear, something extraordinary happened. His stone magic, which she'd been sensing as a subtle undercurrent, suddenly resonated with the enchanted metal. The gear's teeth glowed with a soft amber light that matched his eyes, and beneath their feet, she felt the inn's foundation shift ever so slightly, as if sighing in contentment. Oh! Jill's eyes widened, and she nearly fell off her perch in excitement. Oh, that's properly interesting! She scrambled down, her toolkit jingling as she moved closer to examine the phenomenon. The gear was spinning slowly in his palm, responding to magic that felt ancient and familiar all at once. Her usual mischievous grin faded into something more thoughtful. "The inn's been waiting for someone," she admitted, the words carrying more weight than her typical chatter. Reaching into her largest pocket, the one that somehow held far more than it should, she withdrew a complex arrangement of interlocking gears and laid them out on the kitchen table. With quick, precise movements, she arranged the mechanisms in a pattern that mirrored the ley line network running beneath the inn's foundation. "See these?" Her small fingers traced the paths between the gears. "They're like the inn's heartbeat. Been trying to get them to align properly for ages, but something's always been missing." The orc watched intently, and then, to her absolute delight, began to hum. The sound started low, almost subsonic, an old orcish battle hymn that spoke of protection and steadfast guardianship. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Every mechanical device in her kitchen began to vibrate in perfect harmony. The gears on the table shifted slightly, clicking into positions she'd never quite managed to achieve before. Jill's eyes grew wide as saucers as she recognized the protective resonance in the tune. It was like a key fitting into a lock she hadn't even known existed. Her t-shirt flickered rapidly through several phrases before settling on "provisional approval granted" in bold, decisive letters. She straightened up, which, admittedly, didn't make her much taller, and extended her tiny hand toward the orc. Her toolkit glowed with warm acceptance, tools chiming in a chorus of approval that made the kitchen feel cozier than ever. "Right then," she declared, trying to sound official despite the excitement bubbling in her chest. "I suppose we should do this properly." She cleared her throat, her free hand absently adjusting a gear in her pocket. "I'm Jill Cricklepot, Brownie First Class, Chief Engineer and Security Specialist of the Hearth Crust Inn. And you," she added with a knowing twinkle in her eye, "might be exactly what this place has been waiting for." The gear in Draven's palm pulsed once more, as if punctuating her words, and somewhere in the distance she heard Cog's metallic wings approaching. Her raven always did have impeccable timing when it came to meeting potential allies. She just hoped he hadn't brought along any of his recently acquired shiny objects. First impressions were important after all, even if they involved slightly larcenous mechanical birds. Jill hopped onto the kitchen counter with practiced ease, her movements as precise as the gears in her beloved tools. The height brought her eye to eye with their unexpected visitor, and she couldn't help but notice how the stone-like sheen of his skin caught the warm kitchen light. Her t-shirt rippled, letters rearranging themselves to read, "Interview in progress" in a no-nonsense font. She reached into her third pocket on the right, the one specially enchanted to keep baked goods fresh, and pulled out one of her special honey oat cookies. The gesture felt right. There was something about this orc that called for proper brownie traditions. Breaking the cookie with careful precision, she extended half toward him. "Go on, then," she encouraged, watching intently as his large hands moved to accept the offering. Despite his imposing size, Draven handled the delicate cookie as if it were made of spun glass. Not a single crumb fell as he took it, and Jill felt a surge of approval. Her t-shirt agreed, shifting to display gentle giant checkmark in flowing script. She'd seen too many folk who thought size meant they could be careless with delicate things. Swinging her legs in a rhythm that matched the inn's subtle magical pulse, she took a bite of her own cookie half. "So stony," she said, letting her casual tone mask the sharp assessment in her gaze. "What brings a guardian type to our dusty little inn?" The flour dusting the counter beneath her boots puffed up slightly with each swing of her feet, creating tiny clouds that danced in the afternoon light. His response came in the form of a weathered piece of parchment, carefully unfolded to reveal intricate runes that made her heart skip a beat. The map! Jill nearly dropped her cookie in excitement, hopping down from her perch to get a better look. Her small fingers traced the familiar patterns, leaving trails in the settled flour that perfectly matched the mysterious symbols in the map's corners. "Well, pickle my widgets," she breathed, noting how the flower patterns seemed to shimmer with a faint magical resonance. The inn's foundation thrummed beneath her feet, as if responding to the map's presence. Then Draven began to hum, and everything changed. The sound started low and deep, an ancient battle hymn that spoke of protection and unwavering duty. Jill's tools began to vibrate in their pouches, each one singing back in perfect harmony. Without thinking, she joined in with a brownie working song, one her grandmother had taught her for maintaining magical foundations. The melodies twined together like ivy around stone, her higher notes dancing around his steady bass line. The kitchen seemed to glow warmer, and her t-shirt shifted to display "Music Critic on Duty" in elegant musical notes. Pots and pans swayed gently on their hooks, and she could have sworn the old wooden spoons were tapping out the rhythm. "Been ages since these old walls heard proper guardian music," she remarked, watching as golden motes of magic dust swirled in the space between them. The inn's very stones seemed to lean in, drinking in the harmonies like a plant soaking up sunlight. Her tools hummed contentedly in their pouches, and even Renshi, usually the most particular of her implements, was vibrating with obvious approval. The map on the counter pulsed in time with their song, its runes growing brighter with each measure. Jill noticed how the flower patterns she'd inadvertently created were starting to glow too, forming connections between the map's mysterious markings. She kept humming, but her mind was racing faster than a runaway gear mechanism. Every brownie knew that true guardian magic couldn't be faked, and what she was witnessing now was as genuine as it got. Her fingers twitched toward her special pocket, the one containing her most sensitive magical detection tools, but she resisted the urge. Some things needed to be felt rather than measured, and right now, every fiber of her brownie being was telling her that something long dormant in the hearth and crust was finally awakening. The harmonies faded naturally, but the warmth in the kitchen remained. Jill's t-shirt cycled through several phrases before settling on "magical moment witnessed" as she studied their visitor with new eyes. The way he stood, how the inn's magic seemed to curl around him like a contented cat, the gentle strength in those stone-touched hands, it all added up to something she'd been waiting for without even knowing it. She brushed flour from her dress, sending up another small cloud that caught the light like fairy dust. The map still glowed faintly on the counter between them, its runes pulsing in time with the steady magical heartbeat of the inn. Jill felt the weight of the moment settle around her shoulders like a comfortable shawl, and for once, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence with chatter. Instead, she reached into her leftmost pocket, the special one that somehow always contained exactly what was needed, and pulled out an ancient iron key that hummed with the same frequency as Draven's battle hymn. The metal was warm against her palm, as if it too had been waiting for precisely this moment. Jill hopped down from the counter, her tools jingling merrily as she gestured for Draven to follow. "Want to see something special?" She led him to a seemingly ordinary wall panel, her fingers dancing across its surface in a precise pattern. The wood grain shifted beneath her touch, revealing intricate clockwork mechanisms threaded with glowing protective runes. "These beauties keep the whole place safe," she explained, pulling out her favorite adjustable wrench, lovingly named Twistmaster, and making a few delicate adjustments. "See how the magic flows? Like honey through copper pipes." The runes pulsed softly, spreading warmth through the surrounding woodwork. To her delight, Draven knelt beside her, his amber eyes studying the craftsmanship with genuine interest. Her t-shirt flickered happily to display, "Finally an appreciative audience," as she demonstrated how the various mechanisms interconnected. "This one here," she continued, reaching for a particularly stubborn gear near the ceiling, "needs regular, oof, adjusting." She stretched on her tiptoes, tools nearly slipping from her grasp. Before she could ask for help, a soft rumbling sound filled the air. The floor beneath her feet rose gradually as a perfectly smooth stone platform lifted her to the perfect height. Jill burst out laughing, pleasantly surprised. Most folks would have simply picked her up, a habit that drove her absolutely batty. Her t-shirt changed to "Respects boundaries too" as she completed the adjustment with ease. After finishing with the wall panel, Jill settled into her favorite workstation near the hearth, spreading out her tools with practiced efficiency. Draven moved to examine the stonework, his large fingers tracing the ancient patterns with surprising tenderness. The quiet that fell between them felt natural, comfortable, like a well-worn blanket on a cool evening. She hummed softly as she worked, an old brownie tune about finding home in unexpected places, while her tools provided a gentle percussion of clicks and whirs. Watching Draven from the corner of her eye, Jill noticed how his elemental magic seemed to pulse in perfect harmony with the inn's ambient energy. Her t-shirt shifted to serious business time as she set down her tools. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this place needs someone who understands both strength and gentleness." She gestured around them at the solid stone walls and the delicate enchantments that made them sing. "Someone who can protect without overwhelming, support without constraining." Draven reached into his pack and withdrew something that made Jill's eyes widen. A small stone marker, its surface etched with protective runes that mirrored her own handiwork around the inn. He placed it on her workbench, and she immediately recognized the craftsmanship. The marker hummed with the same protective energy she'd woven throughout the building, like it had been crafted by someone who truly understood what sanctuary meant. The evening light filtered through the windows, painting the kitchen in warm, amber hues. Jill busied herself with reorganizing her toolkit, suddenly very interested in making sure every tool was perfectly aligned. Her t-shirt shifted one last time, letters arranging themselves into a hopeful "Welcome home." She held her breath, pretending to be completely absorbed in polishing Twistmaster while actually watching Draven's reaction from beneath her messy bangs. The inn itself seemed to wait with her, its usual creaks and settling sounds hushed in anticipation. The stone marker on her workbench continued to pulse gently, its light mingling with the inn's protective magic in a way that felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Jill's fingers fidgeted with her tools, waiting for Draven's response to her unspoken invitation to stay. The kitchen chair adjusted beneath Draven with a gentle creak, its wooden frame expanding to accommodate his broad frame. He couldn't help but notice how the furniture seemed eager to please, like an attentive host at a gathering. The warm scent of brewing tea filled the air as Jill arranged delicate porcelain cups with the precise movements of a performer setting their stage. Her t-shirt, which now read "Tea Time Tales" in swirling script, caught the lamplight as she moved. The kettle beside her filled itself with water and began to steam, a sight that would have startled him mere hours ago. Now it felt oddly fitting, like everything else in this peculiar inn. "Sugar?" Jill asked, her small hands hovering over a collection of mismatched containers. "Or honey? The bees that make it are quite particular about their flowers, you know. Very sophisticated little things." "Just plain thank you," Draven replied, watching as she poured with surprising grace for someone so naturally energetic. Steam curled up from the cups in shapes that looked almost intentional, little spirals and curves that danced in the air before dissipating. When Jill glanced away to adjust the tea cozy, a plate of cookies materialized on the table between them. They were golden brown and still warm, as if fresh from an oven that hadn't been lit in days. Her t-shirt flickered to display "Definitely not my baking," accompanied by an animated wink. "Oh, would you look at that?" she said with exaggerated innocence, pushing the plate toward him. "The inn must like you." Draven accepted a cookie, noting how its warmth seemed to travel straight to his core. The taste reminded him of childhood markets and festival days, comfort baked into simple sweetness. Jill settled into her own chair, which raised itself slightly to give her a more commanding position at the table. "There was this traveler once," she began, her shirt transforming to display "Storytime" in bold letters. "Fascinating fellow, claimed the inn's walls whispered secrets to him in the night." The stone magic in Draven's blood stirred with a subtle warmth, his inherited power rippling beneath his skin. He kept his expression neutral, but Jill's keen eyes caught the faint green glow of his elemental nature awakening. "Interesting reaction," she noted, taking a deliberate sip of tea. "You know, that's not the only story about whispers in these walls. There was a merchant last spring who swore the stones themselves were trying to tell her something." Each tale Jill shared wove mentions of stone magic so naturally that they might have seemed coincidental to a less attentive listener. She spoke of travelers who found their way guided by glowing pebbles, of mysterious runes that appeared in the foundation during full moons, of dreams where the earth itself seemed to speak. Her shirt changed again, now reading "History in Progress" as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But nothing compares to that night 3 months ago. The inn's magic. Well, you should have seen it. Lit up the whole village like dawn had come early. Even the whispering willow looked pale in comparison." Draven's stone sense tingled as she spoke, confirming her words. The residual energy still lingered in the very foundations, like echoes in a deep cave. The magical signature was familiar somehow, resonating with something he'd felt in those ancient markers along the hidden path. "Fascinating thing about protective magic," Jill continued, demonstrating with her teacup. She traced a pattern in the air, and the remaining tea inside swirled in response, creating miniature currents that mimicked the flow of ley lines. "It used to move just like this, you see? Before the stone disappeared, that is." She watched him over the rim of her cup, eyes sharp despite her casual tone. The ring warmed against his skin again, and Draven felt the inn's magic pulse in response, like a heart skipping a beat. The air seemed to thicken with unspoken questions as Jill waited, patient as stone despite her typically restless nature. "The stone of Hearthfire," Draven said finally, testing the words. They felt right in his mouth, carrying the weight of truth. A genuine smile spread across Jill's face, her t-shirt shifting to display "Now we're getting somewhere" in triumphant letters. The cookies chose that moment to replenish themselves, and this time neither of them pretended not to notice. Draven watched the cookies shift and align themselves on the plate, their golden surfaces catching the lamplight in a way that made the familiar runes seem to glow. The pattern matched the crystalline sheen of his skin exactly, too precisely to be coincidence. He felt his inherited stone magic respond with quiet recognition. "Funny thing about guardian magic," Jill mused, her shirt now displaying subtle hints "are us" in a playful font. "It has this way of recognizing its own." She traced a finger through the air, and the steam from their teacups wove into intricate patterns. "The inn's particularly good at it. Always seems to know exactly who it needs, when it needs them." The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket, and Draven found himself relaxing despite his usual guardedness. "The markers in the forest," he began, surprising himself with a desire to share. "They led me here, but they weren't just stone and runes. They responded to my magic, showed me the way." "Silvara guided you to them, didn't she?" Jill's eyes sparkled with recognition, her shirt morphing to display connected dots in an elaborate puzzle piece pattern. "That old dryad's more clever than she lets on. Always seems to know which travelers need to find their way here." The inn's ambient magic hummed in response, and the temperature rose slightly, like a hearth being stoked. Jill's shirt briefly flashed "In approved" before she quickly straightened in her chair. "You know, speaking of travelers, there was this fascinating wanderer last winter. Reminded me of you, actually. Had this way with earth magic, though nothing like yours." She launched into a series of tales about past visitors and guardians, each story carefully crafted to mirror fragments of what she'd learned about him: a warrior seeking redemption, a protector looking for purpose, a wanderer carrying the weight of difficult choices. Draven recognized pieces of himself in each narrative, though he kept his expression neutral. The sun had begun to set outside, painting the kitchen windows in deep amber hues. As if responding to an unspoken command, magical lanterns throughout the room kindled themselves, casting a warm, steady light that seemed to pulse in time with the inn's magical heartbeat. "The stone of Hearthfire," Jill said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. It wasn't just about protection. The guardians who wielded it, they understood it was about balance, power and responsibility, strength and compassion. She watched him over her teacup, gauging his reaction. The stone enhanced what was already there, you see. Made the inn's natural defenses stronger, helped it recognize friend from foe. Draven felt the truth of her words resonate through his connection to the earth beneath them. The ley lines hummed with ancient power, waiting to be properly channeled again. His ring thrummed in response, and he noticed Jill tracking the faint green glow with knowing eyes. "But that's probably enough stories for one evening," she announced, hopping down from her perch. Her shirt changed one final time, now reading "To be continued" in elegant script. She gestured to the plate where a single cookie remained. Its surface bore an intricate pattern that made Draven's stone sense tingle, the unmistakable signature of the stone of Hearthfire. "For later," she said with a knowing smile, already backing toward the door with the peculiar grace of someone who knew every creaky floorboard by heart. "When you're ready to hear the rest?" The magical lanterns dimmed slightly as she departed, their light steady and reassuring. Draven studied the lone cookie, its pattern seeming to shift in the gentle illumination. The inn's magic continued to pulse around him, patient and welcoming, waiting for his next move. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Inn. Draven was about to reach for the marked cookie when a soft thump drew his attention to the inn's front desk. The guest book of whispers had fallen open, its pages ruffling in a non-existent breeze. His stone sense tingled as he approached. There was magic here, old and purposeful. The pages settled, revealing entries from exactly 50 years prior. The neat rows of text caught the lamplight, and Draven leaned closer, drawn by the peculiar sheen of the ink. It looked wet, as though written moments ago, yet the dates clearly marked these as ancient records. His eyes caught on the final entry. "The stone pulses with warning. Something approaches through the veil, and I fear our defenses may not be enough to contain." The sentence ended there, a dark splatter of ink trailing off the page. Draven's stone-forged ring warmed against his skin, responding to some hidden resonance in the book's magic. "Ah, I see it's showing you that particular night." Jill had reappeared beside him, her t-shirt now proudly displaying History Lesson 101 in scholarly script. She carried a thick ledger, its leather cover worn smooth with age. "This might help explain things better." She set the ledger on the desk beside the guest book, and Draven immediately recognized the runes etched into its surface. They matched his crystalline skin patterns exactly. His earth magic stirred stronger now, as if the very ground beneath the inn was paying attention. "The stone of Hearthfire wasn't just lost," Jill explained, her shirt morphing to display plot thickener in dramatic, dripping letters. She pulled an assortment of enchanted tools from her many pockets, laying them out with precise care. "Here, let me show you what happened to the protective network." Using a combination of clockwork devices and what appeared to be crystallized magic, she created a miniature representation of the inn's defensive system. Tiny lines of force connected various points, creating a complex web of protection. But there were obvious gaps in the pattern, places where the magic simply ended. "See these breaks?" She pointed with a delicate tool that hummed with stored energy. "Each one represents where the stone's power should be anchoring the defenses." She activated another device, and a small surge of magic attempted to bridge one of the gaps, only to fizzle out with a sad little puff of smoke. Draven closed his eyes, extending his stone sense deeper into the foundation beneath them. The ley line network sprawled out like a vast root system, but now he could feel the discontinuities Jill had demonstrated. His ring pulsed in response, almost reaching for these empty spaces, recognizing the void where the stone's power should have been. "I've tried everything I could think of to patch the system," Jill continued, producing more intricate devices from her seemingly endless pockets. Each one demonstrated a different aspect of the original protections, and each demonstration ended with the same result: a small puff of failed magic, highlighting just how crucial the stone had been to the whole network. Her t-shirt changed again, now reading, "Band-Aids don't fix ley lines in a medical cross pattern." 50 years of temporary fixes, she sighed, gesturing to her collection of mechanical innovations. Some work better than others, but none of them can truly replace what was lost. She picked up a particularly complex device that resembled a miniature windmill crossed with a sundial. "This one maintains the basic perimeter alarms, but it needs constant winding." Another gadget looked like a pocket watch that had merged with a compass. "This keeps the confusion wards active around the forest path, but only during the new moon." Draven studied each device, impressed despite himself by the ingenuity behind them. His stone sense could feel how they integrated with the remaining magical framework. Clever mechanical solutions filling in where ancient power once flowed. But they were indeed temporary measures. He could sense the strain on the system, the constant need for adjustment and maintenance. The Guest Book of Whispers chose that moment to turn another page on its own, revealing a detailed sketch of the stone of Hearthfire. The drawing seemed to shimmer, the runes along its surface resonating with his elemental heritage. As he studied it, his earth magic provided another layer of understanding. This wasn't just a defensive focus, but a key that unified all the inn's protective magic into a single, harmonious system. The stone didn't just amplify the existing magic, he observed, tracing one of the runes on his bracer. It transformed it, made it more than the sum of its parts. The ground hummed in agreement beneath his feet, and he could feel the truth of it in the very foundations of the inn. Jill nodded enthusiastically, her shirt flickering through several exclamation points before settling on, "Now you're getting it." She gathered her tools with practiced efficiency, though her expression remained serious. "That's exactly what made it so special, and why everything I've tried is just, well..." She gestured at her collection of devices, each one a testament to both her skill and the impossible task she'd set herself. "It's like trying to replace a heart with a bunch of clever clockwork. You can keep things moving, but it's not quite alive in the same way." Draven ran his fingers along the wall, tracing the familiar runes that matched his map. The stone whispered beneath his touch, carrying echoes of old magic that resonated with his elemental nature. Each marking seemed to pulse with remembered power, like a fading heartbeat struggling to maintain its rhythm. "The Guardians weren't just protectors," Jill explained, holding up a crystal lamp that cast dancing shadows across the ancient stonework. "They were conduits. The stone of Hearthfire chose them, and through that connection they became part of the inn's very essence." Her shirt flickered briefly to display "It's all connected" in spiraling text. As they walked deeper into the inn's passages, Draven felt the stone sense growing stronger, guiding him forward. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished, with an underlying pattern that reminded him of crystalline formations deep within the earth. "Here we are," Jill announced, pushing open a heavy door inscribed with protective sigils. "The Heart Chamber." The circular room before them held a profound emptiness at its center. A stone pedestal rose from the floor, its surface carved with intricate channels that spiraled outward like frozen ripples in a pond. Though the stone of Hearthfire was long gone, Draven could feel magic humming through the pedestal, calling to something deep within his core. He approached slowly, his inherited earth magic awakening. The residual energy seemed to reach for him, testing, questioning. Without thinking, he placed his hand on the pedestal's surface. A jolt of recognition shot through his crystalline-touched flesh, and for a moment he could almost see how the stone's power had once flowed through this space, anchoring and amplifying the inn's protective magic. The last guardian disappeared the same night as the stone, Jill said softly, her shirt morphing to display mysterious circumstances in fog-like letters. The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably, and Draven watched his breath mist in the suddenly chill air. After that, everything started to fade. The protections, the connections, even the inn's natural magic began to weaken. The weight of loss hung heavy in the air. Draven found himself humming an old Ortsish battle hymn, one his grandmother had taught him about standing strong in dark places. The low, resonant notes filled the chamber, and to his surprise, the pedestal began to glow. Faint lines of light traced previously hidden runes across its surface, runes that perfectly matched both his crystalline flesh patterns and the cryptic map. "By all the little gears," Jill breathed, her eyes wide. She scrambled forward, pulling out various devices to measure and record the unexpected phenomenon. "I've never seen it respond like that. Not to anyone." She produced the worn ledger from earlier, flipping through pages of careful notes and detailed diagrams. "We tried, you know. Over the decades, we searched for someone who could restore the connection." Her fingers traced lines of text as she spoke. Mages, elementalists, even a few who claimed to be descended from the original Veilborn. None of them could properly attune to what remained of the inn's magic. Draven studied the glowing runes, recognizing patterns that spoke to his stone sense. The magic here wasn't just residual, it was waiting, like a seed in winter soil. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory. "Some songs can only be sung by those who carry the right harmony within them." "Look at this," Jill continued, showing him a series of failed attempts documented in the ledger. Each entry ended with variations of the same conclusion: insufficient resonance, no magical compatibility, unable to establish connection. The inn's magic rejected them all. It's like it was waiting for something specific. The glow from the pedestal pulsed gently in time with Draven's breathing, creating ripples of light that spread through the carved channels in the floor. He could feel the magic responding to his presence, not just to his stone sense, but to something deeper, perhaps even to the burden of redemption he carried. As they made their way back through the passages, Draven noticed the walls felt warmer, more alive. The stone sense revealed subtle shifts in the magical currents around them, as if the inn itself was stirring from a long sleep. Jill walked beside him, her shirt now displaying "Hope Returns" in cautiously optimistic letters, while she watched him process everything they'd discovered. The weight of possibility settled around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. He'd come seeking sanctuary, a place to atone for past mistakes. Instead, the inn's magic pulsed around him with growing strength, offering something he hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than break. "Tea?" Jill offered as they emerged into the main hall, her voice carefully neutral despite the excitement evident in her quick movements. "I think we have quite a bit more to discuss." Draven knelt beside the empty pedestal, his knees settling into the worn grooves of ancient flagstones. Placing his palms flat against the floor, he closed his eyes and let his earth magic sink into the foundation. The crystalline patterns in his skin awakened, their inherited power synchronizing with the subtle thrum of magic beneath the inn. Layer by layer, the stone's memory unfolded before him. Like reading the rings of an ancient tree, he could sense the impressions left by decades of magical resonance. The foundation stones held echoes of countless footsteps, whispered conversations, and the steady pulse of protective magic that had once flowed through every corner of the hearth and crust. "There's something here," he murmured, his deep voice falling into harmony with the inn's ambient magic. Dust motes swirled in the air around them, catching the dim light and forming ghostly patterns, after images of the stone of Hearthfire's power preserved in the very walls. Beside him, Jill crouched down, her shirt now displaying detective mode active in glowing letters. She pulled out a tiny notebook, its pages covered in cramped diagrams and notes. "The walls always felt like they were trying to tell us something," she whispered, careful not to break his concentration. "We just couldn't understand the language." Draven pressed deeper with his stone sense, following the threads of an old disturbance. 50 years ago, something had torn through the inn's magical defenses, leaving scars in the ley line network below. The stone remembered the shock of it, the sudden absence where powerful protection magic had once flowed. "Here," he said, tracing a pattern in the dust. The ley line disruption started in the eastern corner, then spread outward like cracks in glass. His fingers followed the path of the damage, revealing how the protective magic had fractured and faded. Jill scribbled furiously in her notebook, her shirt changing to research assistant as she documented every detail. "The timing matches our records," she confirmed. "But we never knew the exact pattern of the failure before." As Draven's awareness settled deeper into the foundation, new details emerged. Hidden beneath layers of accumulated magical residue, a series of runes had been carved into the cornerstone. They matched fragments from his map, but here they were complete, undamaged by time and weather. "Look at this," he said, channeling a touch of power through his ring to illuminate the ancient markings. The runes glowed with a soft, green light, revealing connections he hadn't noticed before. "These aren't just protective symbols, they're part of a larger circuit." Jill's shirt shifted to Puzzle Master as she pulled out several mechanical devices from her many pockets. "The stone of Hearthfire wasn't just sitting on that pedestal," she said, measuring the distance between rune clusters with a brass caliper. "It was integrated into the inn's entire magical infrastructure." She produced a series of thin copper wires and began laying them along the rune paths, creating a physical representation of the magical connections. "See how these channels mirror the mechanical principles of energy distribution? The stone wasn't just powering the protections, it was regulating them like a magical governor." Draven nodded, feeling the rightness of her assessment in the stones themselves. The runes formed a complex network designed to channel and balance powerful forces. His stone sense revealed how the stone of Hearthfire had once interfaced with this system, its power flowing through the inn like blood through veins. "The stone was the heart," he said, understanding dawning as he felt the empty spaces in the magical architecture. "But the inn itself is the body. Even without its heart, it's still alive, just dormant." Jill's eyes lit up as she connected another piece of copper wire. That's why none of the potential guardians could bond with the inn's magic. They were trying to replace the stone's power directly, but that's not how the system was designed to work. She gestured to the rune network they'd uncovered. The guardian and the stone were meant to work together, each supporting and amplifying the other. Draven sat back on his heels, absorbing this new understanding. Through his stone sense, he could feel the inn's magic responding to their discovery, like a sleeping giant stirring. The very foundations seemed to hum with renewed purpose, recognizing something in him that resonated with its original design. His earth magic awakened, the crystalline patterns in his skin aligning with the ley lines beneath his feet. Each breath he took seemed to flow through the ancient channels, temporarily strengthening the remaining protective magic. It wasn't enough to restore the inn's full power, that would require the Stone of Hearthfire, but it confirmed what they'd suspected in the heart chamber. The inn wasn't just offering him sanctuary. It was offering him a purpose, a chance to heal something broken and protect those who sought shelter within its walls. As his grandmother had taught him, some songs could only be sung by those who carried the right harmony within them. Here, in the foundations of the hearth and crust, Draven's stone magic sang in perfect harmony with the inn's ancient power. Without conscious thought, Draven began humming one of his grandmother's battle hymns, an ancient melody that spoke of stone and strength and steadfast hearts. The sound resonated deep in his chest, and to his surprise, certain stones in the foundation began to vibrate in response. His stone sense picked up the harmonics as they spread through the inn's structure, creating a complex pattern of magical frequencies. "The stones," he murmured, breaking off his song. "They're tuned to specific notes." He pressed his palm against the nearest resonating stone, feeling how its frequency matched perfectly with the old Orcish melody. The inn's ambient magic swelled around them, harmonizing with the lingering echoes of his song. Jill's eyes widened as she adjusted one of her measuring devices. "The whole foundation is like a giant musical instrument. Each stone carries a different frequency, and they're arranged in—" She traced the pattern with her finger. "Protective circles. The magic flows through them like sound through pipes." Draven shifted his weight, channeling more power through his ring to enhance his stone sense. As he did, something caught his attention, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious structure. "There's damage here," he said, brushing away decades of dust from a section of flooring. "Hidden beneath the surface." Using his stone-shaping ability, he carefully peeled back layers of mineral deposits, revealing scorch marks etched deep into the foundation stones. The magical residue was old but still potent enough to make his skin tingle. His stone sense picked up echoes of the conflict, flashes of intense magical discharge, the crack of stone under pressure, and a surge of protective energy from the inn itself. Jill's shirt flickered to "plot twist detected" as she pulled out more specialized tools from her endless pockets. "These burn patterns," she said, measuring their depth and spread. "They're not from an attack. Look at how they radiate outward from the pedestal instead of toward it." Draven nodded, feeling the truth of it in the stones themselves. He channeled more power through his ring, using its enhancement of his abilities to reconstruct the flow of magic from that night. The visualization formed in his mind like a three-dimensional map of energy currents, showing how the stone of Hearthfire's power had moved through the inn's defensive network. "The last guardian," he said slowly, watching the pattern unfold. "They didn't lose the stone in battle. They channeled its power through these frequencies, using the inn's own defensive network to—" He paused, understanding dawning. "To hide it, deliberately." "That explains why no one could find it," Jill exclaimed, her tools whirring as they detected something in the walls. She pressed her ear against the stone, listening intently. "There are mechanical triggers embedded throughout the structure. They're keyed to the stone's energy signature, like an ancient security system." Her shirt proudly displayed "Ancient Security System Found" as she began mapping the network of triggers and mechanisms. Each discovery revealed more about how the inn's original defenses had functioned, with the stone of Hearthfire serving as both power source and key. Draven returned his attention to the pedestal, something tugging at his stone sense. The empty stand wasn't just a resting place for the stone. It was a control center, encoded with information that only someone with the right abilities could access. He pressed both hands against it, letting his stone magic flow freely through the ancient runes. The message hidden in the pedestal's crystalline structure emerged slowly, like a whisper rising from deep underground. It wasn't words exactly, but a series of magical frequencies that resonated with the ley line network beneath the inn. To his stone-attuned senses, they formed clear coordinates, a map written in the language of earth and magic. "The last guardian left us directions," he said, pulling out his map and beginning to trace the pattern. But they could only be read by someone who could speak to stone. The frequencies aligned perfectly with certain markings on his map, revealing a path he hadn't been able to see before. Jill peered over his arm, her shirt now reading "X marks the spot," as she compared his tracing to her mechanical readings. "The triggers in the walls match these frequencies," she said excitedly. "It's all one system. The stone's hiding place is locked behind a series of magical and mechanical safeguards that only the right guardian could navigate." Around them, the inn's magic pulsed with renewed vigor, as if awakening to the possibility of reunion with its heart. Draven felt it in his bones, a surge of purpose that resonated with his own magic. The stone of Hearthfire hadn't been stolen or destroyed. It had been protected, preserved for the right moment and the right guardian. He studied the newly revealed path on his map, his grandmother's battle hymn still humming in the back of his mind. The stones beneath his feet thrummed in harmony with both the song and his magic, creating a resonance that felt like coming home. Whatever trials lay ahead on this path, the inn's magic had chosen to share its secrets with him. Now he just had to prove worthy of that trust. Draven's concentration on the pedestal broke as movement caught his eye. The guest book of whispers, that peculiar tome he'd noticed earlier on the front desk, drifted down from its shelf like a falling leaf. It settled on the kitchen table with a soft thump, its worn leather cover gleaming in the lamplight. The pages began to turn on their own, fluttering rapidly as if caught in a phantom breeze, before stopping abruptly. Several entries on the exposed pages glowed with a subtle luminescence that made his stone sense tingle. The magical residue felt old but purposeful, like runes carved by a careful hand. "Now that's interesting," Jill murmured, pulling an ornate magnifying glass from one of her countless pockets. Her t-shirt shifted to display Codebreaker in shimmering letters. "See how these signatures connect? They're not random at all." Draven leaned closer as she traced the pattern with her finger. Through her enchanted lens, the signatures seemed to pulse and shift, forming geometric shapes that tickled something in his memory. The ink flowed like liquid metal, reorganizing itself under their scrutiny. Following his instincts, he knelt to examine the stone floor more closely. His fingers traced the subtle patterns in the flagstones, patterns that matched the flowing signatures above. Each room number listed in the guest book corresponded to a specific point where the ley lines crossed beneath the inn's foundation. He could feel the energy nodes through his connection to the stone, like pressure points in the Earth's own nervous system. "Look at this!" Jill's excited voice drew his attention back to the book. Her shirt now proclaimed "Pattern Found" in bold letters. She had arranged several small gears and springs from her toolkit around the open pages, creating an impromptu calendar. These dates aren't random either. Every major entry lines up perfectly with a ley line convergence. It's a temporal map. The earth magic in Draven's veins awakened as he reached out to touch one of the glowing entries. The sensation shot up his arms like lightning, and new text appeared between the written lines, ghostly words visible only in the soft green glow emanating from his crystalline flesh. "Clever," he muttered, reading the hidden message. The previous guardian encoded information about the stone's path right here in plain sight, but you'd need both stone magic and the right timing to see it. Jill was already pulling more parts from her seemingly bottomless pockets, her shirt changing to read "Visual Aid Expert" as she worked. "Let me show you how it all fits together," she said, assembling a complex network of tiny gears and crystalline tubes on the table. "This is how the stone's energy would have flowed through the ley line system." Her mechanical model was surprisingly accurate, matching the sensations Draven felt through his stone magic. Tiny pulses of light traveled through the crystal tubes, mimicking the ley line network beneath their feet. The way the energy cycled through specific points matched perfectly with the pattern of guest signatures. The stone wasn't just powering the inn's defenses, Draven realized, watching the flow of energy in Jill's model. It was using the ley lines to distribute its power across multiple anchor points, like hiding pieces of itself in different locations, all connected through the earth. His elemental heritage stirred as he compared the model to the hidden text in the guest book. Each entry contained a fragment of information, a direction, a magical frequency, a pattern matching his crystalline flesh. Together, they formed a set of instructions for following the stone's trail through the ley line network. The guest book's pages turned again of their own accord, revealing more entries with that same subtle glow. Draven noticed how the hidden text changed depending on which part of the page his stone magic illuminated, creating layers of information that could only be read in the correct sequence. Jill adjusted her model, adding small markers at key intersection points. "See how the energy flow changes at these junctions?" She pointed to where the light pulses shifted color and intensity. The stone must have used these points to redirect its power, making it impossible to track unless you understood both the mechanical and magical aspects of the system. Draven nodded, feeling the truth of it in the stones beneath them. The previous guardian had created an elaborate puzzle, one that required not just magical ability, but also an understanding of how the inn's various systems worked together. His stone magic might let him read the clues, but he'd need Jill's mechanical expertise to follow them correctly. He pressed his hand to the floor again, letting his awareness sink into the ley line network. The energy patterns matched Jill's model perfectly, but now he could feel something else. A rhythm in the flow that reminded him of his grandmother's battle hymn. The stone had been hidden using not just magic and mechanics, but music as well. Each pulse of energy through the ley lines followed the tempo of an ancient, orcish melody. Draven traced his finger along another cryptic comment in the guest book. Moonlight pools beneath the crooked oak where whispers gather. The words sparked recognition. He'd passed that distinctive tree earlier, its twisted branches reaching over one of the ancient stone markers. Here, he said, pointing to a spot on Jill's mechanical model. That oak stands directly above a ley line junction. His stone sense hummed in confirmation, the memory of that location's energy signature clear in his mind. Jill adjusted her contraption, adding a small crystal that pulsed with a bluish light. Like this? Her shirt flickered to display "We're getting warmer" in softly glowing text. The guest book's pages brightened in response, casting a gentle luminescence across the kitchen table. More entries caught his eye. Spring waters sing sweetest where three paths meet, and the standing stones bow to morning's first light. Each seemingly whimsical observation corresponded perfectly to landmarks he'd encountered along his journey to the inn. Without thinking, Draven began humming his grandmother's battle hymn again, the low melody rumbling in his chest. The sound resonated with something in the guest book, certain entries vibrating ever so slightly, their ink shimmering like disturbed water. Each resonating entry described a location along the path he'd traveled, marking the guardian stones that had guided him here. Oh! Oh! Jill bounced excitedly, her pigtails bobbing. She darted to a cabinet and returned with a sack of flour. We need to see this properly! Before Draven could protest, she was on her hands and knees, sprinkling flour across the kitchen floor in precise lines. Her shirt now proclaimed "Mad Genius at Work" as she recreated their discoveries on a larger scale. Draven had to admit her unorthodox method was effective. The white lines of flour clearly showed how the ley lines intersected beneath the inn, and Jill marked each significant location they'd identified with small mechanical markers from her toolkit. As she worked, a pattern emerged that made his stone sense tingle with recognition. The stone wasn't just hidden, he murmured, kneeling to study the flower map. It was moved along these paths, using the ley line's energy to mask its trail. His fingers traced the route, feeling the lingering resonance in the stone beneath the floor. Each guardian stone he'd passed had served as a waypoint, redirecting the stone of Hearthfire's energy signature to protect it from those who might abuse its power. A detail nagged at him. The map he carried felt suddenly heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out, studying its worn surface before turning his attention to the guest book's binding. There, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them, were runes that matched those on his map perfectly. Acting on instinct, Draven pressed his palm against the book's binding. His elemental magic flared with green light as his inherited power connected with the hidden runes. The air above Jill's flower diagram shimmered, and suddenly they were looking at a ghostly projection of the forest's ley line network, floating like luminous threads in the kitchen air. Eureka! Jill's shirt flashed triumphantly as she studied the projection. Her mechanical model pulsed in perfect synchronization with the ghostly ley lines, creating a three-dimensional representation of the energy flows. The guest book closed with a decisive thump, as if satisfied its secrets had been properly discovered. Draven's earth magic maintained its steady glow, confirming they'd found what they were seeking. The stone's path lay clear before them, written in flour on the kitchen floor and floating in spectral light above their heads. Draven stood slowly, his stone sense thrumming with certainty. Each guardian stone he'd passed had been more than a marker. It was part of an elaborate security system designed to guide only those who could understand its multiple layers of protection. The stone of Hearthfire had left breadcrumbs for its chosen guardian to follow, combining ancient Orcish music, mechanical precision, and earth magic into an intricate puzzle. Jill was already making adjustments to her model, muttering calculations under her breath as she aligned the components with their ghostly counterpart floating above. Her expertise with the mechanical aspects of the puzzle-filled gaps that Draven's stone magic alone couldn't have bridged. Together, they'd managed to decode what others had missed for 50 years. The kitchen hummed with magical energy, the inn's very foundations seeming to resonate with their discovery. Through his connection to the stone beneath them, Draven could feel the ley lines pulsing with renewed purpose, as if the very earth was awakening to the possibility of the stone's return. Chapter 8. The Stone of Hearthfire. Draven's boots crunched softly on frost-covered leaves as he approached the ancient oak. In the pre-dawn gloom, his bracers cast a gentle green glow that pulsed in perfect rhythm with the thrumming beneath his feet. The ley lines were stronger here, their energy so potent he could almost taste it, like lightning before a storm. The oak's massive trunk bore no obvious marks, but his stone sense told a different story. Beneath its gnarled roots, carefully hidden chambers had been carved into living rock. The walls bore traces of ancient magic that resonated with his own, calling to the elemental heritage that showed in his stone-flecked skin. He pulled out the worn map, its runes matching those he sensed carved below. The battle hymn rose unbidden in his throat, a low rumble that seemed to sink into the earth itself. As the last note faded, the ground before him shifted. Soil and stone flowed like water, revealing worn steps that spiraled down into darkness. Draven descended carefully, each step illuminated by his elemental magic's steady glow. The air grew thick with age and magic, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth. The chamber walls were smooth, bearing the same crystalline patterns he saw in his own flesh, as if they'd been shaped by someone sharing his stone-touched blood. His fingers traced the wall's surface, reading its story through his inherited power. These chambers had been crafted with profound care, every surface imbued with protective magic that recognized something in his core. The runes brightened as he passed, acknowledging his presence like old friends greeting a long-lost relative. The passage opened into a circular chamber that took his breath away. Crystalline formations sprouted from floor and ceiling, their facets catching and multiplying the verdant light of his earth magic. At the chamber's heart stood a simple pedestal, carved with the familiar sigil of the Hearth Crust Inn. Above it hovered the Stone of Hearthfire. The artifact was smaller than he'd imagined, barely larger than his palm, but its presence filled the chamber. Veins of energy pulsed through its crystalline structure, matching the rhythm of the ley lines perfectly. As Draven approached, the stone's glow intensified, responding to him like a cat arching into a friendly touch. Through his stone sense, impressions washed over him, echoes of those who'd come before. A dwarven woman with eyes like agates singing protection into the inn's foundations. A human man whose touch could wake the most stubborn stone, crafting secret passages for those in need. Countless others who'd served as guardians, their experiences preserved within the stone's crystalline matrix. His earth magic awakened with increasing intensity as he reached for the stone. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, emerald light flooded the chamber. Energy surged through his crystalline flesh, not painful but overwhelming, like diving into a deep pool of memories. He saw the inn's creation, watched as the first stones were laid over a convergence of ley lines, each block carefully chosen and blessed, witnessed decades of sanctuary given to those in need, magical creatures seeking refuge, travelers lost between realms, souls requiring healing and rest. The inn had been more than a building. It was a promise of safety written in stone and magic, maintained through generations of dedicated guardians. The stone's energy settled into him like it had found its home, neither demanding nor commanding, but offering partnership. Through it, he felt the inn's foundations, the ley lines that fed its protective magic, the very earth that supported it all. The connection sang through his blood, his stone magic amplified and focused by the artifact's power. In that moment, Draven understood why the stone had called to him, why his path had led here. The inn needed more than just protection. It needed someone who could understand its deeper purpose, who carried the earth's magic in their veins and compassion in their heart. His years of wandering, his exile, even his mistakes had prepared him for this role. The stone pulsed once more, sharing a final memory. The moment it had been hidden here, not in fear, but in preparation, waiting for someone who could truly understand its purpose. The previous guardian had known that the inn's next protector would need to be someone who had walked in both shadow and light, who understood the cost of both violence and peace. As the vision faded, Draven found himself standing in the chamber, the stone of Hearthfire cradled in his hands. Its warm light played across the crystalline walls, creating patterns that reminded him of stars reflected in still water. His ring had settled into a steady glow that matched the stone's pulse perfectly, as if they'd been crafted to work together all along. The stone of Hearthfire melded with Draven's magic like two rivers joining into one. Power coursed through him, not the raw force he'd known as a mercenary, but something deeper and more refined. Through the stone, he felt every protective marker he'd passed on his journey, each one pulsing like a heartbeat in the earth. They weren't just waypoints, he realized, but a complex network of anchors maintaining a web of protection around the inn. The stone's energy settled into his chest, and with it came memories he'd long buried. The first time he'd discovered his stone magic, protecting a village from bandits by raising earthen walls. The years spent learning to channel his strength into defense rather than destruction. The moment he'd walked away from his mercenary company, choosing a different path. But now, through the stone's crystalline clarity, these memories felt less like burdens and more like stepping stones that had led him here. All of it mattered, he murmured, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. Every choice, every battle, every mistake. The runes encircling the chamber flared to life, responding to his acceptance. Their light wove together, forming archways of pure energy that sparked recognition in his stone sense. He could feel the inn through them, its foundations hungry for the stone's return. The magical barriers that had weakened over 50 years stirred like a sleeping giant slowly waking. Draven carefully wrapped the stone in a cloth from his pack, though its warmth still radiated through the fabric. The weight of it felt right in his hands, like a key fitting perfectly into its lock. The battle hymn rose in his throat again, but this time he let it flow freely. The words that had once steadied him before combat now spoke of protection, of standing firm against the darkness, of providing sanctuary to those in need. The chamber's crystals caught his song, amplifying it until the very stones seemed to hum in harmony. His stone magic responded differently now, flowing through him with the ease of a mountain stream rather than the forced march it had once been. No longer did he need to wrestle with his power. It moved with him, through him, as natural as breathing. As he climbed the earthen stairs, Draven felt the forest's presence change. The shadows that had dogged his steps since entering these woods drew back, not in fear, but in recognition. His ring pulsed with renewed purpose, their green glow stronger and clearer than before. Through the stone, he sensed the ancient trees themselves acknowledging his passage, accepting his new role as guardian. Emerging from the chamber, Draven paused as sunlight broke through the canopy above. The rays caught his stone-flecked skin, making it shimmer like mica in sunlight. The stone of Hearthfire pulsed in response, its rhythm matching both his heartbeat and the deep thrumming of the ley lines beneath his feet. He flexed his fingers, watching as tiny crystals formed and dissolved in the air around them, a new manifestation of his power that felt as natural as his old abilities. The stone wasn't just amplifying his magic, it was helping him understand its true nature. Stone wasn't merely for fighting or building walls, it was the foundation upon which sanctuary could be built. Through his enhanced connection to the ley lines, Draven felt the path back to the inn with perfect clarity. Each step would take him closer to his new purpose, to the role he'd been unknowingly preparing for throughout his years of wandering. The stone pulsed warmly against his chest, a constant reminder that he wasn't just carrying an artifact of power. He was carrying a promise of protection that stretched back generations. His stone-touched skin caught the morning light, its crystalline surface now bearing subtle patterns that matched the runes in the underground chamber. His inherited power no longer felt like a force to contain. Instead, it had become a mark of destiny, transforming him from a former mercenary seeking redemption into something more. His elemental nature marked him as guardian, protector, keeper of sanctuary. The forest path ahead seemed clearer now, not just physically, but in purpose. Each step felt more certain than the last, his connection to the earth beneath his feet growing stronger with every moment. The stone's power continued to settle into him, not as a burden to bear, but as a partnership freely chosen. Together, they would restore the inn's protections and ensure its sanctuary remained unbroken. Draven walked the forest path with measured steps. The stone of Hearthfire nestled against his chest. Each footfall sent ripples through his stone sense, revealing patterns he'd never noticed before. The ley lines beneath the earth weren't just singular threads of power. They were intricate webs layered like sheets of mica, each humming with its own distinct frequency. He found himself mapping them instinctively, reading their flow as easily as tracking prints in soft earth. Some pulsed with ancient magics, while others thrummed with more recent enchantments. The stone seemed to amplify his awareness, transforming what had once been vague impressions into crystal-clear certainty. The battle hymn rose in his throat again, but this time the stone caught the melody, adding harmonics that made the very ground resonate. Nearby rocks vibrated in sympathy, creating a chorus of stone that echoed through the forest. Draven paused, studying a cluster of granite boulders with newfound curiosity. Instead of reaching out to touch them, he simply focused his thoughts. The stones responded instantly, flowing like water into new shapes. No longer did he need to press his hands against rock to reshape it. The power flowed through him with the ease of breathing, guided by intention rather than force. He let the boulders settle back into their natural forms, marveling at how effortless it felt. A massive fallen oak blocked the trail ahead, its trunk wider than Draven was tall. He approached it, preparing to climb over, when the stone pulsed warmly against his chest. Strength flooded his limbs, not the familiar burn of exertion, but a steady flow of power that made his muscles sing. He gripped the enormous trunk, expecting resistance, but it might as well have been a fallen branch for all the effort it took to lift. The stone's power didn't feel foreign or overwhelming. It merged with his own abilities as naturally as two streams joining to form a river. He set the trunk aside, creating a clear path, then turned his attention to a weathered boulder half buried in moss. As his awareness touched the ancient stone, its history unfolded before him. He felt the immense pressures that had formed it deep within the earth, the slow journey upward through layers of rock, the countless years of wind and rain that had shaped its surface. Magic had touched it too. He sensed echoes of protective wards carved by long-gone hands and the lingering warmth of travelers who had rested against it through the centuries. The stone pulsed again, stronger this time, and new visions flickered through his mind. He saw massive figures of living stone standing guard over ancient temples, their forms both similar to and utterly different from his own. They wielded powers he'd never imagined possible, shaping mountains, sensing the earth's deep rhythms, healing the very bedrock when it was wounded by dark magics. These weren't just random images, they were memories passed down through his elemental ancestry. The stone was showing him his heritage, revealing capabilities that had lain dormant in his blood. He felt a deep resonance with these ancient guardians, understanding now why protecting the inn had called to him so strongly. His elemental core awakened, drawing his attention. New patterns emerged in his stone-touched flesh, glowing with the same inner light as the Hearthfire stone. The crystalline markings matched perfectly with symbols he'd seen in the underground chamber, suggesting a connection he hadn't noticed before. As he studied them, he felt the stone's power flow more smoothly, channeled and focused by his inherited nature. Experimentally, he reached out to a nearby rock face. Instead of the broad strokes of power he was used to, he found he could work with incredible precision. Individual crystals in the stone responded to his touch, allowing him to create delicate patterns and complex structures that would have been impossible before. His elemental magic hummed in harmony with the stone, their resonance refining and directing his growing abilities. The forest around him felt different now. Not just a collection of trees and stones, but a living tapestry of earth magic that he could read like a familiar text. Every rock had its story, every patch of ground its song. Through the stone's power, he wasn't just sensing these things. He was becoming part of the ancient dialogue between stone and earth, guardian and sanctuary. His stone sense extended further than ever before, mapping the network of ley lines all the way back to the inn. He could feel the building's foundations waiting, hungry for the stone's return. But it wasn't just the physical structure he sensed. He felt the layers of protective magic woven into its walls, the accumulated power of 50 years of guests and guardians, all waiting to be renewed and strengthened. Draven leaned against a weathered cliff face, letting his breath steady after the long walk. The moment his back touched the stone, images flooded his mind. Not just surface impressions, but complete layouts of tunnels and caverns honeycombing the rock behind him. The stone of Hearthfire pulsed warmly, transforming the abstract knowledge into crystal-clear understanding. These weren't just random caves. Each chamber had served as shelter at some point, holding echoes of travelers who'd sought refuge from storms or darker threats. Some caverns still held traces of old wards, carved by hands long turned to dust. The stone showed him how these spaces connected, forming a natural network of sanctuaries that could complement the inn's protection. A subtle tremor caught his attention, not from any immediate danger, but a warning of future instability. Without conscious thought, his power flowed through the ground, guided by the stone. The earth shifted beneath his feet, support structures forming deep underground to reinforce weak points. The process felt as natural as breathing, requiring no more effort than lifting a teacup. "Well, that's new," he muttered, running his hand along the cliff face. The stone's power had merged so seamlessly with his own abilities that he hardly noticed using it anymore. This wasn't just about maintaining the inn. He could help secure the entire region, ensuring safe passage for future travelers. Curious about the extent of his enhanced abilities, Draven stepped back from the cliff and focused on a patch of bare ground. The stone responded instantly, rising and flowing like water into walls and a roof. But as the shelter took shape, something unexpected happened. The stone of Hearthfire suffused the newly formed structure with a warm, golden light. Protective runes appeared spontaneously in the rock, similar to those he'd seen at the inn. He ducked inside, marveling at how the small space already felt like a sanctuary. The stone had imbued it with the same welcoming energy as the hearth and crust, though on a smaller scale. This wasn't just a simple stone shelter. It was an extension of the inn's protection, a satellite sanctuary for those in need. Draven pressed his palm against the inner wall, and centuries of memories washed over him. He felt the bone-deep weariness of travelers who'd rested against these rocks, their relief at finding shelter, their gratitude for moments of safety. The The stone helped him understand why certain places naturally became sanctuaries. They held layers of positive emotional imprints, creating pools of protective energy that drew those seeking refuge. A familiar marker stone stood ahead on the path, one he'd passed on his initial journey to the inn. But this time, as he approached, the ancient guardian stone blazed with blue-white light. Runes hidden for centuries revealed themselves, acknowledging his new status. The stone of Hearthfire resonated with the marker, and suddenly Draven could see how it connected to others scattered throughout the forest, forming a web of protective waypoints. Each guardian stone he passed showed him something new: hidden paths, forgotten sanctuaries, places where the ley lines ran strong and deep. They weren't just markers anymore. They were nodes in a vast protective network, waiting to be reactivated. The stone helped him read their ancient purpose, showing him how they'd once worked together to shield travelers throughout the region. As the Hearth and Crust Inn came into view between the trees, the stone's pulse grew stronger, almost eager. Visions flickered through his mind, the inn restored to its full glory, its protective magic extending far beyond its walls. He saw travelers finding their way to safety guided by renewed marker stones, small sanctuaries offering refuge throughout the forest, and the entire region secured by a network of protective magic anchored by the inn. The stone showed him more. Hidden chambers beneath the inn waiting to be rediscovered, guardian stones that could be awakened to create safe passages through the darkest parts of the forest, and places where the natural magic of the land could be strengthened to ward off threats. Each possibility felt real and immediate, not just dreams but achievable goals. Draven paused at the inn's gate, feeling the building's foundation stones calling to the Hearthfire stone. The structure's magic had always been impressive, but now he understood it was only a fraction of what it could become. With the stone's power and his abilities combined, the Hearth and Crust wouldn't just be a single point of safety in a dangerous world. It would be the heart of a living network of protection, reaching out to guide and shelter those in need. He could feel the ley lines beneath the inn pulsing stronger now, responding to the stone's proximity. They weren't just sources of power. They were the veins through which protection could flow, waiting to be awakened and directed. The stone had chosen him not just to guard a building, but to restore something far greater, a system of sanctuary that had been sleeping for 50 years, waiting for the right guardian to return. Chapter 9. A Place to Belong. Draven crested the final hill, the stone of Hearthfire thrumming contentedly against his chest. Golden light spilled from every window of the Hearth and Crust Inn, transforming the building from its usual welcoming warmth into something truly magical. The sight stopped him in his tracks. On the wide wooden porch, Jill bounced from foot to foot, her pigtails bobbing with barely contained excitement. Her ever-changing t-shirt proudly displayed, "Welcome Home, Guardian," in shimmering letters. Around her, a dozen enchanted lanterns danced through the air, arranging themselves into a glowing archway that cast rainbow shadows across the weathered boards. "About time you got back," she called out, her voice carrying the same mix of sass and affection he'd grown oddly accustomed to. "The inn's been practically vibrating since you found it." As if to prove her point, the heavy oak door swung open with a gentle creak, welcoming him home. The entire building seemed to pulse in harmony with the stone, its magic reaching out to embrace him. The sensation reminded him of a cat purring, deeply content and somehow both powerful and gentle. Jill's collection of enchanted tools whirled through the air around her, trailing sparks that formed brief, celebratory patterns before fading. Wrenchy and Twistmaster led the dance, clicking together in what might have been applause. "You did it, Stony!" Jill exclaimed, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. Her t-shirt flickered and changed to read, "Told you so," as she darted forward to examine the stone. Her tiny hands gestured animately as she circled him, muttering technical observations under her breath. "Oh, the resonance frequency is perfect. And look at how it's already synchronized with your natural stone magic. Draven couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm, though he tried to hide it behind his usual stoic expression. The inn helped guide me to it, he admitted, following her through the door. The common room had transformed since his departure. Every piece of furniture had arranged itself in perfect harmony, creating intimate conversation nooks while maintaining clear paths through the space. The hearth blazed with particular warmth, its flames casting a glow that seemed to seek out and soften every shadow. On the central table, a fresh loaf of bread steamed beside a pot of tea that released wisps of aromatic steam in the shape of tiny stars. Jill's mechanical contraptions whirred and clicked along the walls, adjusting curtains and cushions in response to his presence. "The inn knows its guardian," Jill said, her voice softening with rare seriousness. "It's been waiting for someone like you." At the far end of the room stood an ornate pedestal of swirled stone and wood. Runes carved into its surface began to glow as Draven approached, responding to both his stone magic and the Hearthfire stone. The pedestal had been empty when he'd first arrived, its purpose unclear. Now, looking at it, he felt the rightness of what was about to happen. Jill's t-shirt flashed, power level rising, as he removed the stone from its temporary wrapping. The moment his fingers touched it, the stone's light intensified, casting his skin in a warm glow that emphasized its stone-like qualities. He placed it carefully on the pedestal, and magic surged through the inn. The surge wasn't violent or dramatic. Instead, it felt like a deep breath after too long underwater. Protective enchantments rippled outward from the stone, flowing through the walls and foundation like water soaking into thirsty soil. The inn's existing spells didn't just strengthen, they woke up, stretching and expanding like dormant plants reaching for sunlight. A leather-bound book floated across the room, its pages ruffling in an unfelt breeze. The guest book of whispers opened itself to a fresh page and offered him a quill that seemed to be made from a beam of crystallized sunlight. Draven took the quill, its warm weight familiar in his hand, though he'd never held it before. As he signed his name, the ink shimmered with the same stone-like sheen as his skin. The letters somehow both rough as granite and fluid as flowing water. The magic in his signature pulsed once, bright and sure, marking him officially as guardian of the Hearth and Crust Inn. "There," Jill said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "Now you're stuck with us." Her t-shirt changed again, reading "One of Us" in cheerful letters. The stone of Hearthfire pulsed in agreement, sending waves of contentment through the room. Every piece of furniture seemed to settle more firmly into place, and the hearthfire burned a little brighter. The inn's magic wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Draven felt truly at home. Draven followed Jill through the inn's winding corridors, watching with quiet amusement as she darted ahead like an excited sparrow. Her t-shirt proudly displayed Master Planner in elegant script that somehow managed to convey her boundless enthusiasm. "You'll love what I've done with your quarters," she called over her shoulder. "Been working on them ever since the inn first whispered your name to me." She flung open a heavy oak door, revealing a spacious suite that immediately resonated with his stone magic. The walls held a subtle sheen that reminded him of polished granite, and carved runestones were thoughtfully placed at key points throughout the room. A workbench dominated one corner, its surface inlaid with strips of different minerals that would help focus and amplify his abilities. "The storage spaces respond to your magical signature," Jill explained, tapping a seemingly solid wall. It rippled like water, revealing shelves perfect for his few possessions. "And look!" She bounced over to the workbench, her tools orbiting her head like eager satellites. "The whole thing's connected to the ley lines beneath us. Should make your stone-shaping practice much easier." Draven ran his hand along the workbench's surface, feeling the latent power thrumming beneath his fingers. The care and consideration in every detail touched something deep within him. "You did all this without knowing if I'd come?" "The inn knew," she said simply, her eyes twinkling. and I always trust its judgment." They made their way to the kitchen next, where Draven's presence seemed to wake something ancient and joyful. Kettles began whistling in harmony, their steam forming intricate patterns in the air. Fresh dough rose in bowls that gently rocked themselves, while dishes floated in graceful arcs to arrange themselves on shelves. "I've modified all the enchantments to work with your stone magic," Jill explained, ducking as a particularly enthusiastic whisk swooped overhead. "The whole place runs on a combination of my tinkering, the inn's own magic, and now your connection to the stone of Hearthfire. Watch this." She tapped a series of runes etched into the counter, and Draven felt his magic respond automatically. The stone floor rippled, raising a platform that brought higher shelves within easy reach. "Practical and impressive," he noted, unable to keep the appreciation from his voice. Without conscious thought, he found himself humming one of the old Orcish battle hymns that had always brought him comfort. To his surprise, the inn picked up the melody, its creaks and whispers providing a perfect counterpoint. Jill joined in with what seemed to be a traditional brownie working song, her clear voice weaving between the deeper notes. The three-part harmony filled the kitchen with warmth, and Draven felt the stone of Hearthfire pulse in response. His magic flowed more freely than ever before, naturally reinforcing the building's foundations and strengthening its protective wards. "The inn chose well," Jill declared, her t-shirt now reading, "Excellent Judge of Character," as she watched him work. "You're already making it stronger." They settled at the kitchen table, where tea and fresh-baked bread appeared as if by magic, though Draven suspected Jill's subtle orchestration. Her expression grew more thoughtful as she stirred her tea, the shirt changing to read "Story Time." "You should know what it's been like," she said softly. 50 years without a proper guardian. The inn never gave up hope, though. It kept its heart beating, kept protecting those who needed shelter. But it was hard. Her voice carried the weight of years spent watching and waiting. "We had to be clever, had to find ways to maintain the magic without the stone's anchor." Draven listened as she described the various tricks and innovations she'd developed, the ways she'd helped the inn adapt and survive. Her dedication to protecting this sanctuary moved him deeply, resonating with his own need to safeguard and nurture. "But now," she continued, her shirt shifting to "worth the wait" as her smile returned, "we can do so much more. The inn's already stronger than I've ever seen it, and this is just the beginning." As evening settled over the inn, Draven found himself back in his quarters, feeling the stone's power flowing through the building like a steady heartbeat. The room had adjusted itself to his preferences without him having to say a word. The light was perfect, the temperature just right, and even the air held a hint of the mineral scent he found comforting. Jill appeared in his doorway for a final check, her t-shirt now displaying "Family Found" in warm, glowing letters. "Sleep well, Guardian," she said softly. "You're home now." As she left, Draven placed his hand against the wall, feeling the inn's magic pulse in response. The stone of Hearthfire's energy flowed through him, strong and sure, confirming what he'd already known in his heart. After all his wandering, all his searching, he'd finally found where he belonged. Dawn crept through the kitchen windows of the Hearth Crust Inn, and Draven found himself following an irresistible aroma that seemed to wrap around him like a warm embrace. The stone of Hearthfire pulsed gently against his chest as he approached, responding to unfamiliar magic that felt light and airy compared to his earthbound power. As he rounded the corner into the kitchen, he caught his first glimpse of the source. A petite fey woman with silver-blue wings that caught the morning light like dewdrops on spider silk. She moved with fluid grace between floating measuring cups and hovering spice jars, her golden brown hair adorned with tiny flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The stone's pulse quickened, and the fey turned, her emerald eyes sparkling with delight. "So you're our new guardian!" She beamed at him, sprinkling what appeared to be stardust into a bowl of dough. The magical particles caught the light and swirled like a miniature galaxy before melting into the mixture. Draven felt his usual stoic expression soften involuntarily. Something about her presence radiated peace, easing the constant tension he carried in his shoulders. He noticed Jill perched cross-legged on a high shelf, her patchwork dress creating a colorful contrast against the weathered wood. Her t-shirt proclaimed "Introductions in Progress" in swirling script. "I'm Amara Dupital," the Fey woman continued, her wings giving a slight flutter as she worked the dough with practiced movements. "Head baker and creator of magical sustenance for our wonderful inn." Her hands moved in graceful arcs as she shaped the dough, weaving strands of magic into the mixture that Draven could sense through his connection to the stone. "Each recipe strengthens different aspects of the inn's protection," Amara explained, gesturing to various treats cooling on racks around the kitchen. "These lavender shortbreads enhance the sleeping wards in the guest rooms, while the cinnamon twist bread reinforces the boundary spells." She paused her work to retrieve something from a nearby cooling rack. "Here, try this," she offered, holding out a golden brown scone that radiated earthen energy. "I crafted it specifically with stone magic in mind." Draven accepted the still warm treat, noting how the stone of Hearthfire hummed in approval. At the first bite, his stone sense exploded with new awareness. The inn's magical architecture revealed itself in startling clarity. He could feel every runic foundation stone, every enchanted support beam, every layer of protective magic woven into the very mortar between the stones. "Remarkable," he murmured, turning slowly to take in the expanded magical landscape now visible to his enhanced senses. "Every recipe here tells a story," Amara said, her wings catching the light as she moved to another workstation. "The spices speak of protection, the grains whisper of strength, and the sweetness." She smiled, adding a pinch of what looked like crystallized sunlight to a bowl of batter. "The sweetness reminds us why we protect this place." As she spoke, the stone of Hearthfire began to resonate more strongly with her baking magic. Ingredients lifted from their containers, dancing through the air in intricate patterns. Flour and sugar swirled like cosmic dust, while herbs and spices orbited around them like eager planets. Above them, Jill's shirt changed to read, "Magic Fusion in Progress," as she watched the display with evident delight. Draven felt his own magic responding, the stone beneath their feet warming slightly. The marble countertops took on a subtle glow, and the kitchen's hearthstones shifted to create better airflow for Amara's baking. "Oh, wonderful!" Amara clapped her hands together, sending sparkles of fey magic into the air. "The inn's already learning how our magic can work together. Your stone sense will help me know exactly when each batch needs to come out of the oven, and my baking can help anchor your protective spells through the shared breaking of bread." She demonstrated by sliding a loaf of dark bread into the oven, then guiding Draven's awareness to its connection with the inn's defensive wards. He could feel how each bubble of air in the rising dough corresponded to a point in the magical barrier, how the crust would strengthen both bread and boundary as it browned. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching Amara's wings and casting rainbow refractions across the kitchen as she worked. Her joy in sharing her craft was infectious, and Draven found himself asking questions about the relationships between different ingredients and magical effects. "The true magic," Amara confided as she shaped another batch of dough, "isn't just in the recipes or the ingredients. It's in the sharing, the breaking of bread together, the way food brings people closer and makes a place feel like home." She glanced up at him with knowing eyes. "That's what you're really protecting here, not just walls and wards, but the heart of what makes this place special." The stone pulsed warmly against his chest, and Draven nodded, understanding dawning like the sunrise outside. This wasn't just about maintaining magical barriers, it was about preserving a sanctuary where different kinds of magic could blend together, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. As flour dusted the air like magical snow, Draven watched Amara's hands dance through the dough, each movement releasing tiny sparks of fey light. The stone of Hearthfire thrummed steadily against his chest, somehow both familiar and foreign, like finding a missing piece he hadn't known was lost. "The first guardian," Amara began, her voice taking on a melodic quality, "was a dwarf named Thornheart." As she spoke, her pastries lifted from their cooling racks, arranging themselves into miniature scenes. A cookie shaped like a stout figure stood proudly before a gingerbread inn. She laid the foundation stones with songs of protection woven into each block. Draven felt the truth of it resonating through his connection to the stone beneath his feet. The very foundation hummed with ancient dwarven harmonies that matched the quiet song he often caught himself humming. Without thinking, he began to murmur one of his old battle hymns, the low, steady notes filling the kitchen. To his surprise, Amara's eyes lit up, and her wings fluttered with excitement as she joined in, her higher, airier tones weaving through his deeper ones. Their combined melody sparked something in the inn's magic. Protective runes flickered to life along the walls, glowing softly in time with their song. Above them, Jill's mechanical raven, Cogs, whirred appreciatively, its gears clicking in rhythm. The brownie herself swung her legs from her perch, her t-shirt now reading, "Musical Magic in Progress." Amara paused in her kneading, her wings casting iridescent shadows across the counter. "You see," she said softly, "the inn needs both strength and nurturing, like a hearth needs both stone and flame." She gestured to a tray of cooling scones, each one glowing with gentle warmth. "My baking brings comfort, makes people feel safe enough to lower their guards. But that only works because guardians like you maintain the hard boundaries that keep real threats at bay." Draven nodded, understanding dawning. He placed one hand on the counter, letting his stone scents flow through the marble. "Show me," he said. Amara's smile brightened the kitchen. She guided him through the process of infusing her next batch of protection pastries with his stone magic. As she worked the dough, he channeled his power through the counter, up through her baking stone and into the mixture. The result was remarkable. Rolls that carried both the warmth of her fey magic and the solid strength of his stone craft. "Perfect!" Jill called down, her shirt now proudly declaring, "Perfect balance!" as she watched their magical collaboration. They spent the next few hours exploring the inn's daily rhythms. Amara explained how her morning pastries awakened the protective wards, filling them with energy for the day ahead. "The cinnamon in the morning buns stimulates the alert wards," she demonstrated, sprinkling the spice which sparked and danced in the air, while the vanilla in the evening cookies helps them settle into a quieter watchfulness. Through the stone of Hearthfire, Draven could feel the truth of her words. The inn's magic ebbed and flowed like tides, responding to the cycles of baking and breaking bread. His stone sense revealed layers of protection he hadn't noticed before, subtle wards woven through shared meals and comfortable conversations. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the kitchen windows, Amara pulled a special loaf from the oven. Steam rose from its golden brown crust, carrying the scent of herbs and ancient magic. Draven recognized the guardian runes scored across its surface. They matched the ones etched into the stone of Hearthfire. "This is Guardian's bread," Amara said, her wings folding softly behind her as she presented it to him. "Baked with protection, strengthened with stone magic, and blessed with fellowship." She broke it into 3 pieces, sharing them between herself, Draven, and Jill, who had finally descended from her perch. As they ate together, Draven felt the inn's magic wrap around them like a warm embrace. The stone pulsed with contentment, and he realized that this moment of shared bread and combined magic was what he'd been seeking all along. Not just a place to guard, but a place to belong. Above them, Jill's shirt shifted one final time, settling on family complete as the last rays of sunlight painted the kitchen in shades of gold. The day's fresh-baked breads cooling on their racks, the gentle whir of Cogs settling onto his perch, the lingering harmonies of their shared songs. It all spoke of home in a language Draven's heart finally understood. Through the stone, he felt the inn's approval. its ancient magic recognizing this new balance of strength and nurture, of protection and comfort. As darkness fell outside, the kitchen's hearth blazed warmer, and Draven knew with certainty that he had found his place at last. Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review on Amazon.